So, hello. Look good. I look really bright on that screen, but I don't care. Fix this light somehow, but yeah. Okay. Today, I woke up early, get some homework done. Decided to go to bed early instead of stay up late, so that way I can wake up early instead of getting up early, a little less early. We're going to be reading Feminism and the Art of the 20th Century, as well as there's another one we got here today. I can't show that. Shit. Actually, okay, hold up. I'll move this over. Just in case. We're also, Export Women's Art is the other reading. I'm not sure who that's by, but anyways. We're also going to be playing some Minecraft.
What is feminist art? In the early 1970s, artists, critics, and historians who were part of the feminist movement believed that, like the women's movement itself, art made by feminist women represented a radical new beginning, a part two in the history of Western culture to complement the largely masculine history that would now become part one. The goal of feminism, said early spokeswomen, was to change the nature of art itself, to transform culture in sweeping and permanent ways by introducing into it the heretofore suppressed perspective of women in the new world order that would follow. Part 3 There would be gender balance in art and culture, and universality would represent the experiences and dreams of both females and males. 20 years later, we may smile at so utopian a vision, having learned that there is no such thing as a singular female perspective, that not all art by women is feminist, not even all art made by women who are feminists, having lived to see the feminist art movement of the 1970s contextualized by critics and historians as just another avant-garde movement followed by other movements, and finding ourselves in a period that is chillingly, to feminists, called post-feminist.
People are like, I'm sure people are like, oh man, I'm an artist, I can't be prejudiced. Ooh. Bro, I'm an artist. What do you mean? I'm woke. I think that's kind of a good lesson in general, right? It's that we're always kind of questioning stuff and trying to push the argument further. Some might say that's even kind of a bad thing too. I don't think so completely when it's done, when it's something to push, right? And obviously not everything is, but I think the stuff that comes to the surface like this. Written, to be fair, but this helps being pushed by my professor and everything. I think it kind of shows that there is still stuff to be pushed further. That's always good to keep an open mind to.
In which self-defined feminist art continues to be made, but in forms that differ radically from their 1970s predecessors. How then do we situate the feminist art movement on the broader stage, conceptually and historically? Is it merely another phase of avant-garde? Or is it not, rather, to borrow a phrase that has been used to describe the cultural climate of the 1960s, one of those deep-seated shifts of sensibility that alter the whole terrain? The feminist critic Lucy R. Lippard argued persuasively in 1980 that feminist art was neither a style nor a movement, but instead a value system, a revolutionary strategy, a way of life, like Dada and Surrealism and other non-styles that have continued to pervade all movements and styles ever since. Why what
exactly
was revolutionary in feminist art, Lippard explained, was not its forms but its content. Feminist artists' insistence on prioritizing experience and meaning over form and style was itself a challenge to the modernist valorization.
A clear layer that is called hard as nails, and I'll put it on usually I just do 2 fingers, black, because I think it looks cool. Also 3 is kind of a cool number for me. So yeah, I'll usually put that on top of the clear. And my goal is, at least with these 2 fingernails, I want to be able to pick guitar a little bit easier with them.
Of progress and style development, in endlessly different ways, wrote Lippard, the best women artists have resisted the treadmill to progress by simply disregarding a history that was not theirs. Thus the agenda of feminist...
Whoa, that seemed really deep. Hold up. That seemed like they were spitting some fire there. What'd they say? What was revolutionary in feminist art, Leapart explained, was not its forms but its contents. Feminist art insistence on prioritizing experience and meaning over form and style, true, based, was itself a challenge for modernist valorization of progress in style, development in endlessly different ways, Leapart. The best women artists have resisted the treadmill to progress by simply disregarding a history that was not theirs. Thus, the agenda of feminist art cannot be subsumed into that of modernism. That makes sense. Okay, now I see what you're saying. You're basically saying, yeah, women, feminism as like an art movement shouldn't be viewed in the same way as like an art movement like, let's just say Cubism. That's like a really, and it's kind of like way further back in, like, that's like 1920s, right? When Cubism was kind of starting to really take off. I should know this. Like, Cubism is the basic like art movement. I should know when it starts. Okay, I should probably search it up now so I don't embarrass myself in the future. When did Cubism begin? So I could be like, oh, actually, in 1850 there was the first Cubist painting, 1907. Okay, I was like 10 years off. 13 if you want to be exact. 17 to 27 if you want to be exact. Anyways. Yeah, so what they're saying is that, like, feminism is more than just kind of like a art style movement. It's instead of being about form or style, it's about the idea. It's, concepts and everything. And so it cannot be subsumed into modernism, which is another art movement, especially in the 1970s.
Art could not be subsumed into that of modernism, and the very appearance of feminist art as early as 1970 was a distant early warning that modernism, and its theoretical commitment to formal values alone, was destined to become a finite historical stage, in this case to be replaced by postmodernism. Feminist art and art history helped to initiate postmodernism in America. We owe to the feminist breakthrough some of the most basic tenets of postmodernism, the understanding that gender is socially and not naturally constructed, the widespread validation...
Fire. Like, that's one we've been kind of going on for like a while, but I think it's really come to the forefront, obviously, with like the trans rights movement and everything. Trans people being part of LGBTQ, obviously, as well. The idea that it's obviously still ingrained to our society, because we're kind of still debating over today, though obviously a lot more acceptance has happened for the trans community. I'm really tired. Where was I with my thought? You ever just do that? You just like lose track of what your thought was and you can't remember? Oh man. Anyways, something about trans rights movements and stuff, But yeah, gender is socially constructed, or gender norms that are different throughout different societies, and thus we should maybe consider gender as something different, as maybe psychological aspects to yourself, and how you identify. Anyways, I mean, like, here's another example. I mean, like, it's until like recently, where like edgelord boys were like made a lot more normalized, which is good and fine. Like, I'm not even like judging it. Putting on nail polish as a guy is something that was like, even today might still be viewed as like, oh man, such a, I'm not gonna try to get banned off Twitch, but some derogatory like slang and stuff to be said afterwards, which is bullshit. Just do whatever you fucking want at the end of the day.
Of non-high art forms such as craft, video, and performance art, the questioning of the cult
and be a libertarian in life where you don't give a shit about what people do, instead of libertarian in law where you want you don't want to be restricted in trying to restrict others in what they believe. Like, oh well, I shouldn't freedom of speech, right? I want to be able to say that I don't agree with trans people, yada yada. Be a true libertarian. Be for people living their life however they want. Don't be a gatekeeper trying to fight for the ability to gatekeep.
of genius and greatness in Western art history, the
Okay,
awareness that
what?
behind the claim
I got distracted by got distracted by talk about libertarianism. Jesus. We owe to feminist breakthroughs some of the most basic tenets of postmodernism, society of genders, socially non-naturally constructed, widespread validation of non-high art forms such as craft, video, performance art, the questioning of cult genius and greatness in Western history, awareness that behind the claims of universality lies an agitated particular standpoint biases leading to turn emphasis upon pluralist virality. Oh my god, for variety rather than totalizing unity. Jesus, that's a fucking deep sentence, and I just mean that like a bunch of buzzwords. I should say buzzwords, but a lot of very complex wording. Let's just say that.
of universality lies an aggregate of particular standpoints and biases, leading in turn to an emphasis upon pluralist variety. Rather than totalizing unity. Point 4 These conclusions could be reached because feminism had Grace Hardigan. Grand Street Brides. 1954. Oil on Canvas, 72x1021/Y, The Whitney Museum of American Art, New York. Gift of an anonymous donor. 11. Created a new theoretical position and a new aesthetic category, the position of female experience. In so doing, it reduced what had previously been considered universal in art to its actual essence, the position of male experience. Quick to follow were the modifiers not just male experience, but white male experience, and then heterosexual white male experience. And once any given work of art was understood to proceed out of and be shaped by specific conditions of gender, race, sexuality, or class, it became equally clear that audiences also responded to art out of their own conditioning, i.e., the art we find most compelling is art with whose maker we share a basis of common beliefs or experience. If it is commonplace in our postmodern era to speak of pluralism and diversity, and if more attention is paid in art publications today to art that arises from a rainbow of races and ethnicities and that addresses social concerns rather than formalist progressions, that is something feminism helped to bring about. It was the feminist art movement, with its politically forceful reinstatement.
Okay. I think I just misheard that. What did that say? It can equally clear that the audience also responds to art out of their own conditioning, true, based. The art we find most compelling is the art with whose maker we share a basis of common belief and experience. If it is commonplace in our postmodern era to speak of pluralism and diversity, and if more attention is paid in art publications today to art that arises from a rainbow of races, ethnicities that address social concerns rather than formalist progressions, they're basically saying they're addressing social issues instead of progressing art technique further. Let's just say that form is often talked about like in the actual making of the art. Like, oh, look at that color. That's part of the form. Look at that shape. That's part of the form, right? Well, as they're talking about, instead of focusing on advancing abstract forms further that we've been progressing social concerns, which I think is fun too. That's something that feminists help bring about, It was feminist. Okay. So yeah, now I understand what they were saying. Okay. I don't need a G-force experience.
Of figurative imagery, portraiture, and the decorative, that forced an expanded definition of modernism and opened up new avenues of expression to male as well as to female artists. Yet, ironically, postmodernism's definition and critique of modernism as a sterile and reductive formal language lacking in rich content was based uncritically upon modernism's self-definition as pure and transcendent of all lesser values, a self-definition that was, in turn, based upon the systematic denial of the contributions of women to the history of 20th century art. Feminist art history, through its rediscovery of the oeuvre and different voices of neglected women artists such as Paula Modersohn-Becker, Frida Kahlo, Alice Ned, Louise Bourgeois, and many others, has revealed that diversity and pluralism were in reality a far greater part of the modernist movement than either modernism or postmodernism, intent on defining itself in opposition to the modernist other, has permitted us to see. 6. The deep-seated shift brought about by the feminist art movement of the 1970s concerns more than
read that to understand what just happened. Okay. Excuse me? This is a hard reading. This is a lot of words. And maybe it's because I'm still waking up, but I did have myself some caffeine already. Right? Okay. These conclusions could be reached by feminism had created a new theoretical position and a new aesthetic category, the position of female experience. In doing so, it reduced what had been previously considered universal in art to its actual essences. The position of a male experience, quick followed by modifiers are not to male experience, but to white male experience, then the heterosexual white male experience. Basically, the least marginalized group having the having the most overarching viewpoint and effect on society. And once any given work of art was understood to proceed out of and being shaped by specific conditions of gender, race, sexuality, and class, it became equally clear that audience also respond to art out of its own conditioning. See, this is what I mean by this is all good stuff too. By the way, I'm not criticizing this. I'm criticizing more of the art world in general. Right now, I think everyone's a little up their own asses to an extent, even though we're reading literally about art movements. Because I feel like you need to have a fucking PhD in art history or I shouldn't. Okay, that's an exaggeration, right? But you need to have an education in art history just to appreciate to be a good artist within the art world, the high art world. You need to understand the art movements and all this other stuff, and I think that's kind of also an example of what to say that the audience responds to its own conditioning. I feel like there's a big disconnect between the art world, high art world, versus the common people. And I think that's look, there are some stuff I do agree is very good that comes from high art. For example, trying to push ideas further instead of just kind of rehashing the same thing, which kind of happened in art. It's oh, cool, I love landscapes, I'm gonna make landscape art. It's yeah, but there are literally thousands upon thousands. In a most very jaded view, if you are really into the art world, you're gonna be trying to find the things to push the ideas the furthest, and something that's been already rehashed, even something that the general public might respond to more and might not be pushing ideas further. At the same time, I feel like this could be pushed in other ways where I know, for example, Morse Critical doesn't what's his name? The guy that does splatter paintings. I should know this too. Oh god, I'm so bad with names, but let's just search it up right now so I can remember. What's his fucking name? It starts with a P. Yeah, Pollock. Jackson Pollock. You know, like I know he's like, how is his art? I actually do kind of understand a little bit because at least he's trying to push against like convention of what form could be. That's what they were talking about, like modernism kind of thing too. They were talking about like how form is kind of the focus. There's focus on form at the time and how that form can be pushed further from like being to be representation of something without being exactly the exact one-to-one representation of that thing, right? Or at least in the traditional sense, where has like a good example is that like a potluck painting versus like a portrait that's supposed to look identical to the person, right? And maybe both those are actually represent a person, but the one that's done in fine detail to look exactly like that person, versus it's gonna say, oh, that's just trying to get the exact image of that person, versus like a Pollock painting. I don't think that's what Pollock even did those paintings for, but it would be like, oh, this represents the person. You'd be like, whoa, oh, well, look at all the splatters. Maybe they're talking about like feelings, you know. So, yeah, that's what I'm saying. And again, I don't think Pollock paintings were representations of people either. Where the fuck did that window go? Did I close it? Oh, hey, speaking of Potluck. How about that? Okay, I must close the window. But yeah, instead of being like an exact representation, it's a figurative representation. That's the word I'm trying to find, right? It's like a metaphor, man. But so I understand that that's where like Pollock was coming from. That like it was supposed to represent something more abstractly, and it was done that way because it was pushing against the norms of what representation really meant through form, rather than from trying to like look good. And again, that's obviously a shifted to as this article talked about like how feminism has pushed that the feminist art movement has pushed that further from being more than just about the form, but being more about the concept, right? At like, and that is good too. Um, at the same time, I do sometimes feel like there is still kind of like a disconnect between like high art and like what the general populace uh, thinks of like high art, uh, especially like stuff that probably focus more on form than concept. I think actually, now thinking about it a little bit further, stuff that focuses more on the concept itself, like feminist art, rather than the form, probably actually connect better with the populace, and that is good to like to hear and know. Yeah, it makes you feel more comfortable with like stuff. Obviously, still today we get like a lot of art that, like the banana on the wall. I'm not sure what that's supposed to represent. Oh my god. Okay. I got typing two questions. Pollock. Did I say Pollock earlier? It's Pollock. Where was Pollock at? I saw the name. Yeah. There we go. Jackson Pollock. I don't want the Wikipedia. I want the. Yeah, give me the MoMA. That's fine. Okay. Now, what was the other question? Oh yeah. Banana Okay. In 1947, Jackson Pollock arrived a new mode of working abroad to international fame. His method consists of flinging and dripping thin enamel paint onto unstretched canvas laid onto his floor studio. This direct physical engagement with the materials, welcome gravity, velocity, and improvisation to his art process, which allows functioning entirely independently from and allowed line and color to stand alone, functioning entirely independently from form. In this case, I think they talk about like 3D form and having like a sense, not like the form I was talking about earlier with like the color and all that incorporated, right? And presents less a picture than a record of fluid properties of paint itself. Yeah, so I'm actually starting to kind of agree with the points critical. Jackson Pollock is kind of a boring ass bitch artist. I don't know. It's fine. Meaning, yes. Give me the meaning. I want to know. Symbolize of global trade, a double entendre, as well as classic device humor. What? Yeah, I mean, kind of, but like, I think there's better ways you can emphasize that. But to be fair, that's kind of make a marker of the art world itself, maybe. I don't know. Wait, bananas are a symbol of global trade, a double entendre, as well as a classic device of humor. Okay, now I don't even know. It was sold for that much, yet symbol of global trade. It doesn't tell the story as much to me. I mean, like, okay, so like, right? Let's like analyze this. What? Like, honestly, this man I think made more of a statement with the art, for real. But like, let's analyze this real quick, right? Also, back. I just don't want to. Oh no. I just don't want to lose my place. My place. Okay. So obviously, the banner is a symbol of global trade, and that's what the art's about. The banana's gonna. Okay, you gotta think about the saying too. It's like inside like a high art institute. It's kind of like a first world problem kind of thing. It's duct taped. The biggest thing I can think of is like the banana's gonna decompose over time. I don't know. I think it makes more of a statement that was sold for actually $120,000 more than just being there by itself. I think the $120,000 that was sold for was a part of the global trade. It's kind of talking about capitalism in general, maybe, where it's like, oh, people are gonna play super rich amounts for, just materialistic things, without really understanding the systems behind it. But then I feel like the guy that ate the banana achieved that way better than the guy that, like, yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's hard. Anyways.
Just the perspective of modernism versus postmodernism. The movement was also a major watershed in WUMF's history and the history of art. Until c. 1970, there had not yet existed a self-conscious and university-wide female voice in art, self-conscious in articulating female excellence from an informed social and political position, and universalizing in defining one's experience as applicable to the experience of other women. The personal is political, in the 1970s slogan. From the 16th through the 18th centuries, women artists had worked in relative cultural isolation, grouped together by men's classification rather than by choice. Even in the 19th century, though some women artists participated in social movements, feminism, and art had not yet joined forces. Keith Kollwitz's fellow socialists were NBT feminists. Paula Modersohn-Becker's band at Warp Swede was not a feminist group. In 19th century France, many women artists joined in promoting a tart feminine that defined the femme. 9 in art according to the principle of separate spheres, yet these women were frequently at odds with political feminists, and the feminine art that they championed was defined by societally and self-imposed gender stereotypes that turned out to be limiting, conservative rather than progressive. 7 In the wake of the arts and crafts movement in England, women worked to advance the status of woman-identified arts such as needlework, but
in 19th century France, many women artists joined in promoting the Tatre Femme that defined the feminine in art according to principle of separate spheres, yet these women were frequently at odds with political feminists and the feminine from 16th century to 18th century, women artists had worked in relative cultural isolation, grouped together by men's classification rather than by choice. Even in the 19th century, which was 1800s, though some women artists participated in social movements, feminism, and the arts had not yet joined forces. Kenneth Kollwitz's fellow socialists were not feminists. Paula Modersohn-Becker's band of Warp Swede was not a feminist group. In 19th century France, many women joined in promoting the Terre Femme. Many women artists joined promoting that defined the feminine in art according to the principle of separate spheres, yet these women were frequently at odds with political feminists. Okay, I see. Like, feminist artists were saying, like, oh, we should have our own sphere, while the feminist movement was saying, no, you should not be excluded from the sphere, you should be a part of it. Yeah. In the wake of arts and crafts movement in England, women's work and advanced the status of women identified in art, such as needlework. But
advancing the social status of women was not an overt part of the movement's agenda. 8 In America, women's support of other women was manifested at the Philadelphia Centennial of 1876, which boasted the first all-female exhibition space in its women's pavilion and, more dramatically, in the Woman's Building in the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, which was created totally by women, from its architect, sculptors, and muralists to the women from all nations who submitted arts and crafts.
I'm having trouble keeping up with this. This is a fucking deep. Maybe I shouldn't be playing Minecraft, but in America, women support other women manifest and feel different.
Yet suffragists objected to the Women's Pavilion on grounds of class. Elizabeth Cady Stanton complained that working-class women were not represented, and the exhibits did not expose women's political slavery. 9 The Chicago Woman's Building, with its murals of Primitive Woman by Mary E. McManus and Modern Woman by Mary Cassatt, embraced to some degree the agendas of both suffragists and conservative women, thanks to chief organizer Bertha Palmer's insistence on their common cause, but the factions remained separate and opposed. Perhaps the nearest model for the union of art and feminist politics was the banner imagery produced in England at the turn of the 20th century to support the suffragist movement. Yet its practitioners did not form an art movement, nor did they challenge or seek to reform existing categories and hierarchies of art. L1 As the 20th century wore on, many women artists found circumstantial opportunities to exhibit.
I think there's kind of criticizing the where maybe feminist movement, even in the arts, had kind of failed in the past, in reasons why, mainly because of ideology, to maybe a certain extent by not fighting more for having, for being a part of the male sphere versus, or I should say not being part of the male sphere, but rather breaking that sphere, making it all one universal sphere instead of having separate ones. Also, there's some criticism with that American Arts the Chicago World Columbian Exposition. They talked about like no, it's Philadelphia Centennial one. That was criticized as well, obviously, for not representing the kind of class struggles of, you know, some working women of that time by other feminists. So anyways, let's go back.
And developed their work, for example, The Circle of Alfred Stieglitz, in which women photographers were active, the WPA projects of the 1930s, the Surrealist movement, but the women in these groups did not especially identify with each other, and the groups in no way provided them with feminist structures for their art. Indeed, the Surrealist group did the very opposite. There, the concept of the femme enfant, the woman-child, was extolled as ideal and muse by the men of Surrealism, who regarded woman as the incarnation of spontaneity and innocence, untrammeled by reason or logic, and therefore naturally in touch with intuitive knowledge and the world of dreams and the imagination. Surrealism thus exalted the female, but the female imprisoned within a world of childhood and immaturity.
Yeah, it's
and
like,
it perpetuated Western cultures.
You know, it's not even saying that women can't, or men can't be like that, right? I think that's the point, right? Anyone can be like that, but the fact that you're kind of putting that on women, even if it's not supposed to be derogatory or you know, demeaning in any way, it's still kind of doesn't get to the point of like, well, you're kind of categorizing women as like something different from men, when in reality we are all human.
Dichotomous equation of woman with nature and the intuitive, and man with culture and the cerebral, thereby celebrating according to the values of patriarchal society a relationship of inequality. 2. Although women had increasingly swelled the enrollments of art schools in the United States during the first half of the 20th century, very few had been able to make the crucial 12. The power of feminist art. Sophia G. Hayden. The Woman's Building, World's Columbian Exposition, Chicago, 1893. Main Gallery, with Mary Cassatt's mural, Modem Woman. Courtesy the Chicago.
Okay, so hold up. Don't I? Shit, I thought it opened. Okay, hold up. The Broude and Garrard. Okay. I might be a little bit behind. Just Royal Columbian Exposition. Oh, these are pretty. I like this. I like the saturation colors in that one. Oh, that's a cool one. Actually, these are some really cool ones. I think it might still more like surrealism movement though. Okay, anyways, let's get back to it.
Historical Society. Transition from amateur to professional status. The best KNQWN exception was, of course, Georgia O'Keeffe, whose public image, to her own dismay and distaste, had been managed by her husband and dealer, the photographer Alfred Stieglitz, to conform to a male.
No. Although women had increasingly swelled to enrollment of art schools in the United States during, few had been able to make the crucial transition from amateur to professional status. The best known exception was Georgia O'Keeffe, whose public image, to her own dismay and distaste, had been managed by her husband and dealer, photographer Alfred, to conform to male observed sexualized notion of what real woman and her art would be like. That sucks. That's not even a criticism on O'Keeffe either. It's just like, it sucks that she was in that situation.
Observers' sexualized notion of what a real woman and her art would be like. Point 13. In the 1930s, New Deal art programs such as the WPA afforded women artists an unprecedented opportunity for professional employment and identity under conditions that were theoretically egalitarian, but that were still limited by societal assumptions about the cultural superiority of male experience and the male point of view as the appropriate foundations for the making of art. 14 The narrow window of opportunity for women artists that had briefly opened during the economic hard times of the 1930s quickly snapped shut again in the 40s, with the emergence of the critical apparatus that supported the abstract expressionist movement and its macho mystique to which women artists were automatically denied access.
Damn, that's terrible.
Such
Sorry,
an
I
artist
just
was
looked at
Lee
the-
Krasner,
I love
aka
the word
Mrs.
they use
Jackson
here about
Pollock,
criticizing
whose
the male
teacher Hans
part.
Hofmann,
That's good.
in the late 1930s, paid her work what was then considered a compliment. This is so good that you would not know it was done by a woman. Like many women artists in the circles of the Surrealists in the 1930s and the Abstract Expressionists in the 1940s, Krasner took on the time-honored role
With the emergence of critical apparatus that supported the women artists were automatically denied access. Such artists was Lee Krasner, whose teacher Hans Hofmann in the late 1930s paid her work what was considered a compliment at the time. It's so good even though it was done by a woman, like many women artists in the circle of surrealists in the 1930s and abstract expressionists in the 40s. Krasner took on a time on a role of wife of and supported male artists and was soon become better known than she, the other artist became well better known than she would, in whose shadow she lived in until the feminist art movement of the early 1970s forced her to rediscovery. Oh, that's cool. That's actually good though.
wife of and support of a male artist who was soon to become better known than she, and in whose shadow she lived until the feminist art movement of the early 1970s forced her rediscovery. U6 Nina Leeds' famous documentary photo of the irascible says it all, page 16. Among these 14 men, whose names are all today a familiar part of the saga of abstract expressionism, there is only one woman, the painter Hedda Stern, about whose work we know only that it had been characterized disparagingly by Clement Greenberg in a review of 1944 as a piece of femininity. U7 Her unfamiliar name, given Ixitnikliptlrib.I. YL: T Aiken Art in THFT Helen Frankenthaler. Mountains and Sea. 1952.
Hold up. Her familiar name given was a quotas. Hold up, okay. Among these 14 men, whose names were all today familiar, part stock of the abstract expressionism, there's only one woman, painter Hedda Stern, whose work we know only that it had been characterized disparagingly by Greenberg's review in a review of 1944 piece of femininity, come from a name given Helen Frankenheller. Given was a quota system, and in a 1965 interview commented on her relationship with other women artists. Okay, well. Okay, well, look, we'll get back to that in a second. Let's look at these, which... No, it's like... There you go. There you go. Helen Frankenheller. I'm not saying this right. Helen Frankenthaler. And then this is... I think we're about to get to Lee Krasner right now.
Oil on canvas,
No,
860.
I clicked here, which means you start there.
Was a quota system and in a 1975 interview, Miriam Schapiro commented on her relationships with other women artists in the 1950s. Joan Mitchell, Grace Hardigan, Jane Freilich, Jane Wilson and Helen Frankenthaler were all friends and still are. We never discussed problems of ambition and ruthlessness. The spirit of the times did not permit such frankness woman artist to woman artist. We identified and had camaraderie more on the basis of being women than on the basis of being artists. When Helen and I were together, we never discussed our paintings. We were in the same gallery and didn't discuss our work. 19. The IRA's ones.
Nice fan.
1951. Photograph by Nina Lean. From top left, clockwise, Willem de Kooning, Adolf Gottlieb, Ad Reinhardt, Hedda Stern, Richard Pausat Dart.
Stop, bitch. Play.
No gloss in subsequent annals of the movement would no doubt be lost to us today were it not for this amazing photograph, in which she is positioned, like the traditional female muse or allegorical personification of the art of painting, to hover above and behind the men, from whom she is thus emphatically distinguished and to whose group she is clearly not meant to belong. But despite limited opportunities in general for women artists to make a name for themselves during this period, by the late 1950s, a few.
That is so fucked up. Look at this photo, dude. Oh man. Yeah, that's a little disparaging. It's a little disparaging to see. It's also, you know, I don't want to be like for the times because that's like a dumb argument, right? Obviously, yeah, sure, it's great that for the times they did that, but we're past those times. We're trying to push it further, right? So we should be able, you know, see it for what it is, truly. You know, we shouldn't just stop there. It's like, yeah, okay, that should be the given now, right? I'm not saying we can even have like sympathy for like society evolving over time, but like, yeah, we're supposed to like, you know, at the same time understand there's was an attitude to this, and kind of be discussed at least with the attitude that was still there. Obviously that, you know, women artists aren't as important.
Such as Grace Hardigan, Joan Mitchell, and Helen Frankenthaler, had been able to achieve unusual visibility and recognition in the art world as second-generation abstract expressionists, in part because they had cast themselves and were being cast by critics as disciples and followers of the innovative male founders of the radical but by then established abstract expressionist movement. Stereotyped in the critical press as imitators of the styles of men and as jealous rivals for the favors of male mentors, these women had to pay a price for membership even on the peripheries of this all-boys club, and that price was isolation, especially from one another. In response to the question, what was it like to be a woman in the Macho 50s, Joan Mitchell told an interviewer in 1985, "Do you mean, am I a feminist? I am. But I really like painting, whoever does it. The men helped me more than the women. It's still a small world for women and they're cutthroat with each other. At that time, the galleries wouldn't carry more than, say, 2 women.
Oh my god, see? This is fucked up. This is like pitting... Oh god. Like, that sucks. Like, imagine being in a reality where, like, you know, you had to compete against women, and because of how the ingrained structures were, you had... Imagine, right? You think to yourself, like, oh man, it's a cutthroat art world with women here, and, you know, men to men have helped me more, yada yada. When in reality, you know, there's a lot more representation of men artists, and their ideas will perpetuate a lot further. You know, women had to compete with each other to have a voice. You know, it's not like I can even completely blame someone to coming to this conclusion, and I do think we're all prone to, like, getting to the wrong conclusion sometimes, if that makes sense. Or missing the point. But, yeah, just, you know, it's more reason why we got to try to acknowledge this kind of stuff. Stuff that we're prone to not realizing. And the systems around us of what's truly at to blame.
Women artists in the 1950s and 1960s suffered professional isolation not only from one another, but also from their own history, in an era when women artists of the past had been virtually written out of the history of art. H. W. Jansen's influential textbook, History of Art, first published in 1962, contained neither the name nor the work of a single woman artist. In thus excluding women from the history of art, Jansen followed an approach that had already been established in such earlier 20th century art history textbooks as David Robb and J.J. Garrison's Art in the Western World and E.H. Gombrich's The Story of Art. But over the next 2 decades, it was Jensoff's book that became the focus of indignation for a generation of college-educated Americans who had been startled by feminism into questioning the assumption, implicit in Jansen's omissions, that women never had made nor ever could make art that was aesthetically or historically significant. Jansen himself later justified his actions in qualitative terms. "I have not been able to find," he said in 1979, "a woman artist who clearly belongs in a 1E-volume history of art, degree it was in the context of such programmatic cultural and historical exclusion that feminist artists such as Mary Beth Edelson..."
You have to remember, this was 1979. People are like, yeah, bro, I'm a second-wave feminist, but not a third-wave feminist. You know, I believe sexism was a problem. I think we solved it most of today when, like, this was like, what, 40 years ago? 42 years ago? It's not a small amount of time, to say the least, but it's definitely not a long enough time for those kind of, like, if we, obviously, I think we're progressing a lot further with progressive ideas today than we have in the past, to an extent, and part of that's from communicating and being able to have more of open communication, social media being a thing. Spread of ideas is a lot easier, and plus I think it's with the internet, it's kind of easier sometimes to see these issues arise because it's easier to have a conversation about it. That progresses it further because you get more viewpoints and more people can say what they want to say, etc., etc. And plus we get more knowledge of the world around us, which also influences that conversation too. What was I going to say with this? I forget. I'm so fucking tired. Oh, kind of remembered for a second. I had a neuron fire off, and I lost it again. It wasn't enough. Oh yeah, that's what it was. I said about the 19, how we're still kind of it's only been 4 years ago. Obviously today ideas have progressed a lot faster, but I would say we're still not shackled from the influences of anti-feminist rhetoric, of kind of that this idea that women don't deserve rights. This is a very new I don't want to say it's very new. It's we're still very fresh where this is being fought. 1970s is only when art, feminism and art really started kind of getting pushed further. We're still going to be dealing with the effects of prejudice against women for a long while. And I think it's kind of unwise to be oh well, we got all the problems solved today, right? Because we are still influenced by the effects of prejudice that's been done in the past, and how that's shaped the ideas of society of women now, right? Even if we've progressed it further, we still are influenced by our past and passing of women and yada yada, and stuff needs to be pushed, cannot be pushed further, right? Anyways.
Her memorable poster of 1971, Some Living American Women Artists / Last Supper, and Judy Chicago, in the Dinner Party of 1979, page 227, were motivated to create imagery that would literally bring women artists, for the first time, to the table of history. In the pre-feminist 1950s and 1960s, it was rare indeed for a woman artist to find any place at all in the narrative of modernism. And when she did, her position was not defined as that of an innovator, although she may have been one, but as a facilitator of the work of the male artists who followed her. This pattern in the criticism was established early on for Helen Frankenthaler, who stained canvas, mountains, and sea of...
Excuse me, they did what? That's such a bad lie. I hate that so fucking much. it was rare indeed for women artists to find any place in the narrative modernism, and when she did, her position was not defined as an innovator, although she might have been seen as one, but as facilitator of the work of the male artists who followed. God, I can't believe, dude, that's so fucked up. It's so fucked up. Oh, bro. No, bro, she ain't an innovator. She just facilitated the innovation to come. For true innovators, the men. Yeah. God damn it. Oh no.
1952, was given canonical status by Clement Greenberg, when he told of how the experience of seeing it had caused Morris Louis to change his direction abruptly. 21 Greenberg positioned Frankenthaler not as the innovative leader of a new school of painting, but as a precursor, a link between the first generation of male abstract expressionists and the male painters of the Washington Color School, thereby providing her with the only credentials that would at that time have allowed her inscription, albeit marginally, into the annals of art history. Abstract expressionism glorified a virile art, whose very potency and purity depended on its practitioners' rejection of Mary Beth Edelson. Some Living American Women Artists / Last Supper. 1971. Offset poster. Left to right, Linda Bengley, Helen Frankenthaler, June Wayne, Alma Thomas, Lee Krasner, Nancy Graves, Georgia Zero Keefe, Elaine de Kooning, Louise Nevelson, M.C. Richards, Louise Bourgeois, Lila Katzen, Yoko Zero No. Border, 67 other women artists. Courtesy the artist. And struggle to achieve transcendence over the female-gendered world of nature. The women artists associated with the first and second generations of that school professed allegiance to its principles. However, consciously or unconsciously, they developed for themselves a range of personal imagery that as later feminist artists and critics, in search of formothers, were quick to point out appears to have challenged the established paradigm, the taste, for example, for landscape metaphors in the work of Frankenthaler and Mitchell, the egg, breast, and plant forms, and the procreative metaphors that became central to the iconography of Lee Krasner's work from the late 1950s on, or the predilection for figuration and for an iconography that often draws upon the life experiences and roles of women in the art of Grace Hardigan. The question of how or whether the fact of being female had in any way affected the style or the content of these women's art was a question that was increasingly foregrounded by feminist criticism in the 1970s. And for those women artists of an older generation, who had long struggled to negotiate their female identities and to find acceptance as artists pure and simple.
That's something that needs to be established too. You know, these women are kind of fighting with the social standards that influence and affect us every day, and that's got to be kind of hard and traumatizing. You know, to be told oh, what you're doing isn't art, so you reconsider, and that goes against so much, ingrained to how they feel. To whereas today we kind of see oh man, it's terrible, right? But that's something that these female artists actually had to experience, right? Oh, you're doing art wrong, and maybe this doesn't hit as hard because this, unless you're into the art world, but when you get criticized for your art in art school, they go hard intellectually sometimes even to be well, yeah, but what's this art doing, right? And so that can be really disheartening sometimes, and you try to push your art further and explore that, but when the narrative's already kind of wrong, that's it's gotta be frustrating and traumatizing and affects your self-identity. It's cool that they were it's good. It's good that that female artists had the experiences were able to rediscover them, not I want to say themselves, but we're able to push past that, right? That societal barrier that was kind of forced on them in the art world. That's and the kind of traumatizing experiences of that. that's cool. We're actually gonna start making some progress on this. Look at this. We're gonna get down to yeah, look at that. It's good. to repair some stuff. Wait, am I not gonna be able to? Are we out of like stuff to trade? Do you have any glass bottles? I do. Okay, we're gonna have some stuff to trade. We'll get some emeralds. Anyways, so let's get this going back.
And despite what Lee Krasner would later describe as the misogyny of the New York school, 22, it was an explosive and uncomfortable issue that bred both confusion and anxiety. Reactions ranged from Frankenthaler's adamant refusal to be associated or categorized in any way with women artists and their issues of 3 to Krasner's touching openness and willingness to enter into a dialogue with a much younger generation of radical feminists. When students working with Miriam Schapiro in the feminist art program at Cal Arts in 1975 asked Krasner to send them a letter stating the intentions of your art for inclusion in their book, Art, A Woman's Sensibility, she replied, with an implicit awareness of their concerns, I try to merge the organic with the abstract, whether that means male and female, spirit and matter, or the need for a totality rather than a separation.
In this woman of older generations, it's long struggled to negotiate the feminine female identities, to find acceptance as artists, pure and simple, within and despite what Lee Krasner would later describe as misogyny in New York school, was explosive and uncomfortable issue that bred both confusion and anxiety. That's fair, right? That's what I'm saying too. I'm trying to give credit too to like some of these women artists that have to like, you know, they're all products, kind of like what like kind of like a China Cash kind of thing. We're all products of our society, right? Around us. That's why I have a really hard time sometimes blaming people for having like wrong ideas. I think it's good to be. I've followed this over time to like it's good to be subversive to the ideas that people have, but maybe not the people as like. Or I should say, you can be subversive to the ideas people have without being subversive to the people. To like try and change their mind, and that's partly from like watching she was like Hassan, who do like kind of are very subversive to even to their audience and stuff and the ideas that they have, or I shouldn't say their audience, but to like people who think differently to what he believes. He might hold some like older beliefs, some flawed beliefs, you know. Whereas like, oh, you know, if you have a ethical argument, you can over time logic and reason with them. No, sometimes being subversive to the idea actually gets a lot more to discussion and going and moving. So I don't think it's exactly like, oh, these people are being unfair to conservatives or whatever. You know, they're not giving them a fair chance to like learn or whatever. Where I might have held that a little bit more before. I'm like, nah, you can be subversive to, you know, the ideas that people have. Anyways. And then at the same time, though, the double side of this for me at least is that at the same time, you know, people were all products of our society, and you know, maybe we should give ourselves credit for that, or at least understanding of that, and then again to fighting the idea subversively rather than maybe people, so that way you can try to convince more people to join you. Because I do feel like there's a little bit of it, like where if you try to attack the people, they're less. Sometimes they might be less likely to. They'll like lock down, and they'll be less likely to hear out your argument or come to reason, right? Because we're all prone to doing that as well. That's part of the human condition, I guess. Yeah, I think being prejudiced is also part of the human condition. It wasn't like a sideshow episode about like how everyone's kind of like a little racist or whatever. How to build it. Cheapest mining rate. 3090. No, I'm sorry. Look, great channel. You have to check them out. I got delete just for my history though. God damn it. Okay. What was it? Sideshow were all a little racist. Yeah, that's good. Was they like a little bit racist?
In May 2018, Starbucks closed all their American stores for a day to train their employees about implicit bias after accusations of racism. In fact, companies...
Yeah,
All over have been doing this kind of diversity training, teaching their employees about biases in the workplace. So what are they trying to do, and how can we tell if it's helping? Well, implicit bias means something pretty specific to psychologists, and it might not be exactly what you think of when you hear the word racism. And despite good intentions, this training might not be helping as much as we'd hope. First, though, we should mention that even though race and racism are complicated topics, a lot of this research relies on simple comparisons, like using generic examples of people who are black or white. Sometimes that's a necessary part of the study design, and in this video, we're just skimming the surface of this complicated part of psychology. Explicit beliefs are obvious biases that people might straight up tell you, like thinking men are better at math than women, but psychologists use the—
Okay, or let's give a better one, that men are better than women in football and sports, for example. And that's why women shouldn't play sports, or football on the men's team. Which I think is bullshit, by the way. I think if you can, I think sports should truly just be broken up to weight class. I think for one, or chess. Here's another really good example. Chess has this implicit, at least it did for sure. I'm sure, especially with a lot more chess players today, there's a lot more of understanding that women can be just as strong as men. But then there's still this weird separate league for women to play in chess, which makes no sense at all. I think that should just be completely getting rid of. Just guys and girls, same league, no matter what, for chess. For sports, if you really want to have division, because look, I think there are when it comes to actual physiology, there are females can tend to be weaker, but, and this is on a sex thing, right? We're talking about sex purely, but that is kind of just an average, and each individual is going to be different. Women especially, and or women especially. I don't even know why I said that. That makes no sense. Women and men are going to have different feats of strength. For example, I'm a fucking weak ass bitch. I got no muscles, and I'm sure there are some girls that could beat my ass, right? So individually, I think there's a lot of there's a lot of things that should be more focused on individuality rather than a grouping of people. For example, trying to be women shouldn't play football because they're generally weaker. It should be more about can this person play football? Can it be strong enough to compete against the other people who are playing on that team? I think then breaking down sports into weight class rather than gender would be the way to go, because I think there are many exceptions to the standard. In fact, I would say the spectrum of differences you can find within people, right? Every person's different, and I don't think an individual should be barred because they're part of a grouping. I think it should be more about the individual itself. For all you Brotherhood, what's that book called? 1979 or whatever? Big Brother. It's called Big Brother book. No, Big Brother. Yeah, 1984. For all you 1984 stands who are talking about individuality, I think that's another example of that. That needs to maybe be considered, that each individual can, or it's going to be different, and they shouldn't put a group standard on it. And if you really, if there is concern for is this person strong enough, again, I think it should be a weight class thing. I just think it should be a weight class thing for sports. Anyways.
The word implicit to refer to things that act outside of your awareness, which means implicit biases are harder to find and harder to get rid of. One famous way to measure them is called the Implicit Association Test, or IAT. The basic idea is to have people play a sorting game as quickly and accurately as possible, moving pictures to either side of a computer screen. For example, a test of implicit racial bias might involve pictures of faces of white people and black people, mixed in with pleasant and unpleasant photos. And then participants would get different rules about how to sort them. According to the IAT, if people make more mistakes when they're told to sort a black person's face with a picture of a flower or a bunny, they have an implicit association of whiteness with pleasantness. Over several decades, psychologists have used the IAT to note lots of implicit associations that seem to be lurking in people's minds, like women with family, men with work, white with good, and young with good. These implicit associations might contradict your explicit beliefs.
Exactly.
Or even be negative things about you.
Yeah.
Like women and black people have shown negative associations with their own identities. But there's some debate over whether the...
Yeah, I can see that again. Talking about like how, with like makeup products being kind of more towards like white skin and stuff. You know, beauty standards kind of say that you need to have more pure white skin to represent beauty. So like, even for I think makeup products for black people, they sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. We were talking about beauty products for even like black people. They might be, you know, there might be like an implicit bias to try to achieve like this white beauty. That's, and again, it's implicit bias, even though it kind of goes against what you might explicitly think.
IAT means anything beyond how good you are at a sorting game. In a 2009 meta...
So yeah, we're all prone to implicit bias, and that's why I think we should try to be subversive to people's ideas rather than people.
Analysis published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, researchers looked at 122 studies with almost 15,000 participants. All these studies tested whether the IAT could predict prejudiced behavior better than just asking people about their explicit beliefs in a survey. Over all of the studies that tested for implicit associations of black and white people, the IAT was a better predictor of behaviors like using slurs and workplace discrimination than explicit questions about racism. But that wasn't the case for other areas of discrimination, like gender, sexual orientation, or political party. In other words, there was a clearer separation between implicit biases and explicit beliefs with racial prejudice than other kinds of prejudice. And that's not the only concern with the IAT. More recent research has found that the IAT isn't any more useful than more subtle survey questions when measuring racist beliefs. For instance, instead of asking someone if white people are smarter than black people, newer surveys might ask if black people are getting too demanding. And finally, psychologists have only found the IAT to be useful for looking at whole groups, like hundreds of people participating in a study. Individuals are likely to get a pretty different score if they take the test a second time. So many psychologists disagree about whether the IAT is the best way to measure implicit biases. But implicit biases do seem to be real and affect our judgment in other ways too. Like in a 2012 study, 127 science faculty were asked to review application materials for a lab manager job, with either a male or female name at the top. Participants gave higher ratings of competence, higher ability, and higher starting salaries to the resumes with male names. You can find a similar effect with race. Researchers sent thousands of resumes to job ads in Boston and Chicago with either stereotypically white or black names at the top. And the white names had a 9.7% chance of getting called back, but the black names only had a 6.5% chance. Even without explicitly reporting any racist beliefs, participants in studies have also been more likely to remember a character in a story as aggressive if the character was black. Or they overestimated the ages of black kids compared to white kids, and rated black men as taller and stronger than white men, even when their strength and height were matched. So, can we fix these sort of implicit biases? And does corporate training do any good? Well, we start unintentionally learning these associations young, through our environment and culture, so they're hard to avoid. A recent meta-analysis of 400...
That's why we need to, I think that's why it's always still like a push for like societal change, trying to change that perception. It needs to be more normalized too, because that's what kind of helps these implicit biases disappear over time, because they're, again, I think it's part of the human condition to form them, especially if you're in an environment and setting that kind of promotes them to have to form.
192 studies that still
they always are going to form, but like what kinds are going to form, right? If you're in an environment that promotes forming implicit biases against women, for example, or you know, that women can't do football because they're generally not strong enough, which again I think goes against the individual. Again, goes against the individual. I'm starting to sound like Ben Shapiro over here. Goes against like the individual like aspect of it.
Found that
and doesn't really
Inventions,
isn't that logical.
from perspective taking to giving counter-stereotypical examples, can change people's scores on implicit tests like the IAT. But that doesn't necessarily translate into changing behaviors. But an earlier meta-analysis of 515 studies in 2006 reported that just spending time with diverse groups of people works to counteract prejudice pretty well. This so-called intergroup contact works better in some situations than others. Like, having coworkers of different races is more likely to reduce prejudice than, say, managing employees of different races. So it's not as simple as everyone's a little bit racist. But it's good to understand that sometimes you can be biased in your actions, behavior, and judgments. So we can all work to be better. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow Psych, and thanks especially to our patrons on Patreon who make all of our channels possible. If you want to support us, you can go to patreon.com/scishow, or just share our videos to help everyone see the world a little more complexly.
Okay. Anyways, we're gonna minimize this so this window again in the future.
Are questions I have not defined as yet. 24 among the women of the New York School, Grace Hardigan, who exhibited her works under the name George Hardigan until 1954, has been the most vociferously resistant to feminist readings. Understandably fearful, as many women of her generation were, of being ghettoized and stereotyped as a woman artist. As something lesser, Hardigan has consistently maintained that she faced no discrimination and that she was, in effect, simply one of the boys. Her reasons for adopting a pseudonym, she has said, it had absolutely nothing to do with the feeling that I was going to be discriminated against as a woman. It had to do with a romantic identification with /BIPTL, YLKL.
Look. Again, this is to make fun of the person too much, right? I think we're all prone to like telling ourselves these lies, right? It's just, again, it's good to acknowledge them because this is copium.
YAX, LLQH.
Look, I don't care also about this gibberish you're speaking. Don't
Grace Hardigan. Bread sculpture. 1977. Oil on canvas. 70. George Sand and George Eliot. 25. Although Hardigan formed her style in the late 1940s on the model of the painterly abstractions of Pollock, de Kooning, and Klein, by 1952 she started to turn away from pure abstraction and began a lifelong quest for a meaningful iconography. At first inspired by the street life of New York's Lower East Side, the vulgar and vital in American modern life as she then put it, 26, and attracted, perhaps unconsciously, by the rituals of women's lives, their dignity as well as their emptiness, she painted Grand Street Brides in 1954, inspired by the dressed-up mannequins in a bridal shop window, page 11. The increasing independence and fertility of invention in her work over the next decades is exemplified by Bread Sculpture of 1977, whose seemingly whimsical imagery, derived from a book that describes what can be made out of dough, stresses maternal icons and fertility goddesses and plays on the idea of creating art out of the materials of basic human sustenance. When faced in the 1970s by inevitable feminist comparisons between her own interpretations of women and those of her mentor de Kooning, Hardigan resisted readings of female identification in her own work and of misogyny in de Kooning's, adamantly defending the universality of his art, and by extension, her oeuvre. To Cindy Nemser's suggestion that the way you portrayed women is very different from de Kooning's violent interpretations of women, she replied, vehemently but evasively. I disagree with you. The violence is in the paint. De Kooning's women are very loving. When those first women, those 50s women were shown, I had a big argument with Jim Fitzsimmons, who is now the editor of Art International. He said that they were destructive, that it was hatred, Kali the blood goddess. He pointed to one painting that had big palette knife strokes slithering across the chest and said, "Look, de Kooning is wounding her with blood." So I went to Bill and I said, "Jim Fitzsimmons said that you stabbed that woman and that is blood." Bill said, "Blood?" I thought that it was Ruby's 27. Eva Hesse. Ring Around a Rosie. 1965. Pencil, acetone varnish, enamel, ink, glued cloth-covered electrical wire on papier M and CH6 on masonite, 263/8. And to Nemser's comment on Grand Street Brides that it's interesting that you picked up on that particular ritual. It is one that women are trying to come to terms with today. Hardigan abandoned her previously professed fascination with the vulgar and vital in American modern life and countered, I really hadn't thought of it. I was really thinking of Goya and Velfisks, of that empty ritual of the court, all of the trappings. 28 Even a younger artist like Eva Hesse who came to prominence in the late 1960s in a proto-feminist critical context, singled out by Lucy Lippard who emphasized her predilection for circles, soft materials, veils, layering, and repetition. Even Hesse straggled uncomfortably with feminist as opposed to mainstream formalist readings of her work. 29 When asked by Nemser in a 1970 interview if some of her forms had male and female sexual connotations, she quickly retorted, no. I don't see that at all. I'm not conscious of that at all, or not even unconscious. I'm aware they can be thought of as that even in the process of making them, but I am not saying that. 30 And about the meaning of the circle in her art, she said, I think the circle is very abstract. I could make up stories about what the circle means to men, but I don't know if it is that conscious. I think it was a form, a vehicle. I don't think I had a sexual, anthropomorphic, or geometric meaning. It wasn't a breast and it wasn't a circle representing life and eternity. 31 Today, in the 1990s, women artists of the pre-feminist and post-feminist generations are being, in the first instance, critically resurrected and in the second, given critical priority over the feminist generation of the 1970s. The result is to bolster and restore the very art historical and critical metanarrative that the feminist generation had threatened to disrupt. The art of such pre-feminist women as Louise Bourgeois, for
Say in the 1990s. No, this book's old. This book's a little old, but that's good, you know. It's a very forward-thinking book. Today, in the 1990s, women artists are in the pre-feminist and post-feminist generations are being, in the first instance, critically resurrected, and in the second, given critical priority over the feminist generations of the 1970s. The result bolsters restore a very The result is to bolster and restore the very art historical and critical meta-narrative that feminist generations had threatened to disrupt. You know, basically trying to promote artists that were part of the boys, for example, to say that.
Example, is a simile. /O\D0I1HIEIH. W. IW. Louise Bourgeois. Femme Maison. C. 1947. Ink on paper, 9v8x3%. Private collection. Courtesy Robert Miller Gallery, New York. Able today by the mainstream only to the extent that it can be understood to have internalized the man-centered focus of the traditional woman. Bourgeois' work, writes New York Times critic Michael Kimmelman, deals with sexual identity and is about polarities male and female, aggressive and passive. 3Z resurrected now after decades of neglect. She was the only woman to be included in the Guggenheim Museum's inaugural show for its Soho branch in 1992, selected at the last minute to counter and forestall further objections to that show's traditionalist all-male lineup. Bourgeois' intuitive and perversely metamorphic imagery is being used and positioned critically to prop up the old stereotypes rather than to challenge them, and she herself is being used as a role model to Louise Bourgeois. Support the relegation and confinement of women artists to work that deals with sexual identity in its most limited and limiting dualistic sense. This strategy and these readings are not new ones. As Whitney Chadwick has observed of Bourgeois' Femme.Isois paintings of 1946–47, although Bourgeois pointed to the home as a place of conflict for the woman artist, critics at the time read the paintings as affirming a natural identification between women and home. 3Y Today, what is genuinely radical and rebellious about Bourgeois' woman-centered art is being further submerged by a mainstream criticism that wants to bend her into being a link between masculinist movements. There is certainly great irony in the fact that Bourgeois is now being described, in Kiminad's words, as a link to the European roots from which post-war American art sprang, since
Although Bourgeois pointed to homes as a place of conflict for the women artists, critics at the time read the painting as furthering the natural identification between woman and home. Yeah, so they basically just like, oh, well, actually, you know, what you mean by it is wrong. And what we mean by it is, yes, that women in the home are associated together. When she was trying to kind of fight against that, I guess. This place of conflict for the woman artists.
having been marginalized and ignored all these years, she could hardly have played an influential role for America's mainstream male artists, even though her related work and strategies do in many instances predate theirs. In recent years, in fact, following the pattern that Greenberg established for Frankenthaler, and as part of the ongoing backlash against feminism that was begun in the 1980s, we have seen a continuation and escalation of critical attempts to reposition some of the most prominent of the pre-feminist women artists, so that they may now be seen as links between male-dominated movements.
Bullshit.
For example, Hardigan's art, with its predilection for figuration and aversion to the false posturing of gestural abstraction, has come to be seen, and rightly so, as a threat to the historical integrity of abstract expressionism, whose self-definition and position in the normative canon have been closely dependent upon the exaltation of the macho gesture. At first relegated to the deviant category of the movement's second generation, Hardigan has twice been repositioned by critics in the 80s and 90s in ways that seem designed to distance her from the sacrosanct movement that her different voice might threaten to taint. In the 1980s, there was a brief effort to make her into a...
Oh god, this is such a deep read. We're not even like halfway through. Time is right now 6:42. I'd like to be done with this by like 8, but Jesus Christ. To be fair, actually, we should be fine. It's like a lot of this is just like, well, okay, maybe not a lot of it. All this is, but fuck, so we gotta like, is this notes? Go above notes. We gotta get to like here, or like here. Yeah, we're about halfway through. Anyways, there's certainly a great irony in the fact that Bourgeois is now being described as, in Kim Hen's words, as a link to European roots from which post-war American art sprang, since having been marginalized, ignored all these years. Yeah, so she was like, it's you know, she was kind of marginalized, ignored, but yet she's being described as like now, after the 1990s, since it suits the narrative to at least like try to restore the status quo a little bit, that women that push back against feminism by using this as a sample of like women in their place in the home, or the association with the home, the natural identification between woman and home. So it says, it's just funny that, you know, they're saying now that she represents the springboard when in reality she was marginalized. Let's see what else. Anyways, she could hardly have even played an influential role for America's mainstream male artists, even though her related works and strategies do in many instances predate theirs. In recent years, in fact, following pattern of Greenberg's establishment of Frankenthaler as part of the ongoing backlash against feminism that begun in the 1980s, we see an continuous and escalation of critical attempts to reposition some of the most prominent of pre-feminist women artists so that they may now be seen as links between male-dominated movements. For example, Hardigan's art, which, with its predilection of figuration and aversion to the false posturings of abstraction, Jesus, has come to be seen, this is so hard to read, and rightly so, as a threat to the historical integrity of abstract expressionism. Okay, so this one I want to read. For example, Hardigan's art, with its predilection for figuration and aversion to false posturings of gestural abstraction, has come to be seen, and rightly so, as a threat to historical integrity of abstract expressionisms, whose self-definition and position in the normative canon have been closely dependent upon exaltations of the macho gesture. First glance. At first, we gated for the deviant category of the movement's second generation. Hardigan has choice been repositioned by critics in the 80s and 90s in a way to design to distance her from the sacrosanct movements of her different voice that might taint. Is it talking about that, like, there's like macho elements within post-expressionism, or are they saying that there's like a macho attitude towards women artists, like whereas like it was predominantly male dominated, or at least in the mainstream art world it was predominantly male, right? Predominantly male, let's say. I'm not sure what it's trying to say there, and I would need to see like an example. So we'll see. Maybe Louise Bourgeois, the one right there. Oh, this one. No, but Hardigan's art, if there is one. God damn it. Okay.
Forerunner of the so-called New Expressionism in the art of Julian Schnabel, David Saul, and others, a connection that she vigorously rejected. 34 And in 1993, her work, long ignored by the New York art world, was featured prominently in an exhibition at the Whitney Museum entitled Hand-Painted Pop, American Art in Transition, 1955-62, where it was offered up as a link between Hardigan's beloved abstract expressionism and pop art, a movement that she had always scorned and despised. 35. And when Lee Bontekoff's canvas and wire wall reliefs of the 60s are shown again today, after long banishment from mainstream galleries and museums, we read, predictably, that Bontekoff's reliefs fall between and link major art movements, abstract expressionism of the 1950s and pop art and minimal art of the 1960s. 6 We hear nothing of the multiple meanings that these works held in the 1970s, either for the women artists who identified the large, velvet-lined cores of Bontekoff's work with the central cavity of the female and thus the female herself, 37, or for the male critics who, from their own point of view, imposed on them a related but very different kind of sexualized meaning, as emblematic of the threatening vagina didata. Miriam Schapiro has recently said of Bontekoff's works, they were not sexual in the ways the men were then saying. Many of these works were about living in the world and being menaced by war. It was unusual at the time she produced them for woe and to express anger and rage in art. Womp's rage is frightening to men, and so they metamorphosed it into the conventional idea of the Vagabzadenta, creating a myth that could contain the power of women's anger. Bontekoff's work was hot for a time, but then she was driven out of the art world as this persistent and escalating relegation of pre-feminist women artists to the no-man's land of linkage is in part an inevitable result of the continuing refusal, on the part both of the critical establishment and many of the women themselves, to acknowledge gender as a relevant factor and categorize analysis in the framing of the history of mainstream modernism. Nevertheless, the fact remains that these women and their art can never be comfortably accommodated within the structures of the male-dominated and male-defined movements in which they originally worked, unless or until we are willing to acknowledge the historical existence within these movements of the different voices of women, and to modify our characterization of modernism accordingly. Lee Bontekoff. Untitled. 1961. Welded steel and canvas, 72x66x25. The Whitney Museum of American Art, New York. Women artists of the feminist generation differed from the women artists of the 50s and 60s most of all in the deliberate grounding of their art in their socialized experience as women and the corollary of that position in their acceptance of women's experience as different from MEF's but equally valid. In exposing for open consideration what had previously been hidden or ignored, they connected for the first time, in a conscious way, the agendas of social politics and art. The key principle was consciousness raising, defined by Wompf's movement theorists as a method of using one's own experience as the most valid way of formulating political analysis. Accordingly, feminist artists advocated reliance upon the self as the sole source of knowledge, and while Hardigan or Krasner would not have disagreed with that principle, the difference was in the level of socio-political awareness about what a female self was. Feminist artists asserted a new position for Wompf in art, as subject rather than object, active speaker, and not passive theme. And although many earlier women artists might have supported that goal, even the conservative advocates. Introduction: Feminism in Art in the 20th Century 21. Of l'art féminin, the difference was that 1970s feminists were no longer so clear about the nature of female identity, realizing that it was up to them to redefine it. Thus, while the 70s feminist artist was acutely aware of the artificiality and repressive power of what would later be called the social construction of gender, her problem was to find, within a self already badly warped and damaged by social role-playing, an authentic voice that might serve as a basis for a new and liberated construction of female identity.
It's kind of interesting.
Women of the 1970s discovered
talks about gender are like early feminism, right? I think it, this is cool. It's interesting. We're kind of see it develop out, right?
That, in today's parlance, the inner self was a realm already socially inscribed, when they found that there was no way for a woman whose consciousness was being raised to answer the question, who am I? Outside the frame of reference of her gender. The invention of personas and the exploration of roles so prevalent in early feminist art were, on one level, a way of examining the relation between female roles and the inner self, and of clarifying their differences. Their construction of fantasy roles, Eleanor Enton, Lynn Hirschman, see pages 168 and 167, and their sometimes deliberately childlike play, The Dollhouse at Woman House, see Raven, page 65, may be instructively compared with something like Claes Oldenburg's Ray Gun series of 1960-62, whose imaginary hero, based on comic book heroes like Buck Rogers, is a magic ray gun. Both forms of art concern fantasy life, but with the critical distinction that feminists were self-conscious about the gender dimensions of their role-playing, whereas Oldenburg could not imagine a frame of reference outside masculinity, even when, in retrospect, his subject begs for it. Oldenburg's magically empowered alter ego holds New York at bay, a comic hero with real bravado, whose dream is phenomenal personal power. 4 degree Yet for feminist women, the romantic construct of the self versus society did not hold up. Through feminism, women were among the first to arrive at the realization that the self may only exist within social framing, and so the cliché of the individual versus society, which had been a male myth all along, was brought into question by feminist women, who now saw the categories as not only interdependent but also problematic. It was the achievement
God, I'm hungry as hell again. Oh, I have hot dogs right now. Oh, God, I stretched too. Oh. Always get something to eat too. Whatever. Okay, let's get back to it. I'm gonna eat later. We have no food, and I don't feel like going out right now.
Of feminists to articulate that very problem in art. In the words of Judy Chicago, the agenda for women artists was to transform our circumstances into our subject matter, to use them to reveal the whole nature of the human condition. For why, instead of asking, who am I, they posed a new question, who are we, as if only by exploring the shared, collective circumstances of women could individual women come to understand themselves as human beings. One of the first areas of circumstantial identity to be explored was the female body. Artists such as Faith Ringgold, Adrian Piper, and Eleanor Enton sought to reclaim women's bodies from the societal straitjacket of sex objecthood through semi-playful exploration of dieting and fasting, ways in which social expectations literally shaped the female body. From the early 1970s, feminist artists understood their task to be, in the words of Lisa Tickner, the decolonizing of the female body, reclaiming it from masculine objectification. 42 Carolee Schneemann, in Hey Memorable Interior Scroll Performance, attempted the metaphoric transformation
of arts, where we're literally talking about the male gaze and like reclaiming that. So this article's literally about what we're doing this whole semester. Oh, that's great.
Of the female body from passive object to speaking agent. Other artists created body images for the female viewer. Sylvia Slay, in her witty inversions of male/female roles, Hollis Sigler, Janet Cooling, Harmony Hammond, Terry Wolverton, and others, in images and performances directed to the lesbian gaze. Joan Semmel sought gender balance through images of men and women in bed together, sensuality with the power factor eliminated, as Semmel described them. 43 and other feminist artists redrew the male body as negative cultural signifier. Nancy Sparrow, Mae Stevens, Judith Bernstein, whose phallicized images of helmets, bombs, and screws defined the phallus as sign of power long before Jacques Lacan's similar, but not similarly critical, theory was known in the United States. Other feminist artists reclaimed the ancient great goddess through images, rituals, and performance art in an effort to re-establish a female dimension that has long been largely missing in world religions. Their enterprise, which paralleled that of feminist theologians, aimed to replace the masculine archetype, characterized by the mind-body duality, 44 with mind and matter reintegrated. For feminist artists, as in ancient times, the earth is identified as the body of the Great Mother, and through the use of their own bodies in nature-sited rituals, artists like Anna Mendieta, Mary Beth Edelson, Donna Henez, Bataille Sarr, and Betsy Damon forged a new way to affirm the connection between microcosm and macrocosm. In asserting their own sense of connection with matrifocal ancient cultures, these artists were less interested in reinstating female procreativity as a cosmic principle than with changing the gender-distorted relationship between humans and nature that has been a hallmark of patriarchy, to emphasize the wholeness of a non-hierarchized continuum between nature and culture. In these respects, the legacy of the work of goddess artists lies in the growing contemporary concern for the environment, the ecology movement, and in the quest for the renewal of spiritual meaning in modern society. In this spiritual current of feminist art, as in others, the focus is upon we and not I. As feminist artists explored female experience and identity through their art, they created and addressed a new audience. Lucy Lippard has argued that feminist art replaced the modernist egotistical
I want to read this. Authority versions of male and female roles. Honestly, I think it's gonna be. No, I don't know. That self-made exists within social framing, and so the cliche of individual versus societal, which have been a male myth all along, was brought into question by feminist women. What? Okay, I need to go back a little bit. I missed part of that. Yeah, for feminist women, the romantic construct of the self versus society, romanticism was like, think about it like that, not like romantic as in love, romanticism as like the idealized, I guess. The construct of self versus society, you know, like the idea that you fight against society and stuff. That romanticization did not hold up. Through feminism, women were among the first to arrive at the realization that self-made only exists within a social framing. It's a cliche of individual society, which had been a male myth all along, was brought to question by feminist women. It's actually really interesting. You know, the self really interesting read. I love learning about this. It's been lately giving me more of an idea about like how like art movements have affected the art world and like why some stuff is kind of seen as more critical. But it's really hard sometimes. You guys, this is a fucking dense ass reading. But this stuff about like the self versus society. Is interesting, right? That we're all influenced by our society too. I mean, it's part of ourselves. Hold up, that's what I need to. Yeah, I was about to say it's probably about nighttime. Grab all those blocks and go to sleep. Okay, I gotta read some more of this. We saw the categories as not only interdependent, but also problematic. It was achievement of feminists who articulated that very problem in art. The words of Trudy Chicago, the agenda for women artists was to transform art. Oh God, my back. Transform my back. Was to transform our circumstances into our subject matter. To use them to reveal the whole nature of the human condition. Instead of asking, who am I? They pose a new question, who are we? By exploring the shared collective circumstances of women, could individual women come to understand themselves as human beings? One of the first areas of... Oh, man, my back is killing me. Oh. Ugh. Guys, I'm gonna copy some of this. Oh. Because I actually really like this. This is I don't know which room I'm gonna write this at. Do I have like a notes thing? Give me a notepad. I'm just gonna write this down. Paste. Save. Feminism and what art can be. Text. Sure. I'm cool with that. Ready to save to? There we go. Hey, there we go. Give me back Streamlabs. We haven't missed any, like, chat, right? I'm pretty sure that no one's even watching, so that's cool. Let's get that. What else is here? Where's my Babaluka? Babaluka! Or Bala Bolka. Not bad. Wait, where is it? Seriously, where'd it go? What? When did it close? Oh my fucking god. Also, did I close out of all these? Close? No. Close. 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 There we go. Oh. Fuck me. Where were we? Let's start from where I copied the text, because I want to restart part of this.
One of the first areas of circumstantial identity to be explored was the female body. Artists such as Faith Ringgold, Adrian Piper, and Eleanor Enton sought to reclaim women's bodies from the societal straitjacket of sex objecthood through semi-playful exploration of dieting and fasting, ways in which social expectations literally shaped the female body. From the early 1970s, feminist artists understood their task to be, in the words of Lisa Tickner, the decolonizing of the female body, reclaiming it from masculine objectification. 42 Carolee Schneemann, in Hey Memorable Interior Scroll Performance, attempted the metaphoric transformation of the female body from passive object to speaking agent. Other artists created body images for the female viewer. Sylvia Slay, in her witty inversions of male/female roles, Hollis Sigler, Janet Cooling, Harmony Hammond, Terry Wolverton, and others, in images and performances directed to the lesbian gaze. Joan Semmel sought gender balance through images of men and women in bed together, sensuality with the power factor eliminated, as Semmel described them. 43 And other feminist artists redrew the male body as negative cultural signifier, Nancy Sparrow, Mae Stevens, Judith Bernstein, whose phallicized images of helmets, bombs, and screws defined the phallus as sign of power long before Jacques Lacan's similar, but not similarly critical, theory was known in the United States. Other feminist artists reclaimed the ancient great goddess through images, rituals, and performance art in an effort to re-establish a female dimension that has long been largely missing in world religions. Their enterprise, which paralleled that of feminist...
I lost track a little bit. We're going over like a lot of different kind of art movements, or different kinds of thinking. Them to the metamorphic transformation of the female body from passive objects to speaking agents. Other artists created images of the female viewer and her witty inversion male roles. Images performance directed by the lesbian gaze sought to troll and Semmel sought to gender balance through images of men and women in bed together, sensuality with the power factor eliminated. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. It's kind of like showing a non-like, yeah. Other feminist artists redrew the male body in negative cultural signifiers. Nancy Sparrow, Mae Stevens, Judith Bernstein, whose phallicized images of helmets, bombs, and screws defined the phallus as a sign of power long before Jacques Lacan's similar but not similarly critical theory was known to the United States. Other feminist artists reclaimed the ancient goddess through images, rituals, performance art, in an effort to reestablish a female dimension that had long been largely missed in world religions. Okay, now I realize what you're saying. Their enterprise, which paralleled often that of feminist
theologians aim to replace the masculine archetype, characterized by the mind-body duality, 44 with mind and matter reintegrated. For feminist artists, as in ancient times, the earth is identified as the body of the Great Mother, and through the use of their own bodies in nature-sited rituals, artists like Anna Mendieta, Mary Beth Edelson, Donna Henez, Bataille Sarr, and Betsy Damon forged a new way to affirm the connection between microcosm and macrocosm. In asserting their own sense of connection with matrifocal ancient cultures, these artists were less interested in reinstating female procreativity as a cosmic principle than with changing the gender-distorted relationship between humans and nature that has been a hallmark of patriarchy, to emphasize the wholeness of a non-hierarchized continuum between nature and culture. In these respects, the legacy of the work of goddess artists lies in the growing contemporary concern for the environment, the ecology movement, and in the quest for the renewal of spiritual meaning in modern.
Okay. Not to have a problem with any of this at all. My brain's melting. That's all. I got the mother stuff. The Great Mother. These artists were less interested in restating female procreativity as a cosmic principle than was changing the movement in its quest for renewal spiritual meaning in modern society. In the spiritual, talking about as well as like the environmental stuff, environmental, ecological, and spiritual meanings behind it instead. That's cool. Actually, this might also like. This for my my landscape stuff. It's just like something else to reconsider. No, don't. No, 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 no. Oh, damn it! Don't open it up. I hope it doesn't. It's okay. Yes, use text pad. Control B. I got text just now. I think page is just gonna work. Okay. Okay. Where's Babaloka? Did it close again? I'm gonna be so pissed. You bitch. You did close. God damn it. Why? Close. 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 Ow. It'll also feel good. Okay. Just got my neck cracked at least. My neck's cracked, bro. Okay. Save and quit. I'll be right back. Use the restroom. Oh, yeah. Hold up. Should we use my scene transitions? Oh, this is professional. Okay. I'll be right back. time this Kroger's open? 'Cause I might make myself some scrambled eggs. At some point. It's 7:15. I'm sure they're gotta be open by now. How much more? We go from this to like this. It's a decent amount to do, but I think we can get it done before I have to. And worst comes to worst, I'll just finish it later when I get home. Where's Kroger's? When is Kroger's open? They're open. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm gonna get some milk. I'm gonna get some milk and be right back. Parks, I need to eat some food. Some scrambled eggs don't sound good, so I think it's actually gonna be fine. Where the hell did my keys go, though? In my jacket, probably, like usual. Like, kind of per usual, at least. No? Be right back, getting some. I'll be right back. I'm gonna get some milk. I gotta go to the grocery store. And he never came back. might just have, if they was watching, just have to finish, wait for the bacon to finish up and take care of some stuff in the meantime real quick. What hair? Let's try a couple more. Too much juice. Forget this. Let's just go back upstairs with me. Not really new with these pants, I guess. They feel kind of tight already. Not tight, but on tight. I like this. Well, if I can't have my main belts, this won't do. Come on. Oh, I hate this belt sometimes because it's got this fucking. Oh, you just can't pass it through. It's got like this little lip that makes it hard to get through the belt loops. It's just dumb. It's got like this is the belt, right? It's got this, and then it gets caught on every single belt loop. It has this bad design. What the fuck? What's so fucked up with this world, man? Okay, I think I'm finally back. Oh, this looks good. This looks good as fuck. Oh. Okay, anyways,
In these respects, the legacy of the work of goddess artists lies in the growing contemporary concern for the environment, the ecology movement, and in the quest for the renewal of spiritual meaning in modern society. In this spiritual current of feminist art, as in others, the focus is upon we and not I. As feminist artists explored female experience and identity through their art, they created and addressed a new audience. Lucy Lippard has argued that feminist art replaced the modernist egotistical monologue with a dialogue between art and society, between artist and audience, between women artists of the present and those of the past, and with collaboration as a creative mode. Point 45. The feminist position is that, in Lippard's words, for women, a product of multicultural...
Okay, hold up. Too many things going on at the same time. Okay, cool. Yeah, there's no alarm. Stop. It's up 8 o'clock, I know. I'm up. I've been up. I know I set that alarm anyway, so I know I'm stealing it myself, but still, fuck off. Focused upon we, not I, feminist artists who explore the female experience and identity through their art, they created and interested a new audience. Lucy Lippard has argued that feminist art replaced modernist egotistical monologue with a dialogue between art and society, between artist and audience, between women and artists presented those past and collaborations, creative modes. I like that a lot too. That's deep. Hate that does that, but whatever. So let's do this, and then this, and then this, and then this. Yeah. Wait, no, don't. I'm about to leave. I'm eating, Austin. I can't play Minecraft, eat, and read at the same time. That's too much to focus on. You're not gonna get eating done efficiently. Save and quit. Did I minimize that Baba Loca? And oh, you bastard! I hate you. I hate you. Well, I'm still even on the schedule. There we go. Whoa, where are we? Close. Don't load. Just close. Close this. Yes, this.
The feminist position is that, in Lippard's words, art can be aesthetically and socially effective at the same time, by contrast to the masculinist avant-garde model, in which the creative isolation of the artist, out of touch with society, is highly valued. Feminist art is instead deliberately pitched to a public and social context, and as Lippard says, is characterized by an element of outreach, a need for connections beyond process or product, an element of inclusiveness. Hence, collaborative art,
I think it's
performance...
a really good show, by the way, like how much feminists, like art movement and feminism in general, has kind of influenced the art world, because I think there is, at least I feel it is a lot more of a push against like that stereotypical model of instead of being like a dialogue between the egotistical monologue, where you're like the experiences, you're trying to express your experiences, you can make a dialogue with, instead of make a dialogue with yourself, make a dialogue with society, and that's kind of where art is. I kind of feel like right now, like a lot more of art is, at least like high art, right? Also, let me close this curtain. I want to get the sun though, relatively soonish.
Art, environmental art, not exclusively but predominantly feminist forms in the 1970s and 1980s, had in common structures that transcended the individual, whether through rituals that connect modern feminism with ancient myth, or through social protest aimed at affecting public policy. Within the feminist movement, women of color led the way in creating effective forms of social protest art, from Faith Ringgold's tireless activism in the late 60s, fighting racism and sexism simultaneously, to the Wall of Respect. 22. The power of feminist art. For Women, a product of multicultural collaboration by Tomi Ere and other artists in New York City, itself a monument to feminist collaboration. In the mural projects of Las Mujeres Muralistas in San Francisco, as in the citywide performance art projects of Suzanne Lacey and others in Los Angeles, a broader connection between art, community, and social policy was forged. Also, in the late 1970s and 1980s, women artists became increasingly prominent in the field of public art in the United States, an involvement that may seem paradoxical, given the traditional association of women with the private sphere and men with the public. But in an era when Richard Serra's tilted arc had become a symbol for an old-fashioned
Women art became increasingly prominent in the field of public art in the United States, and involvement that may seem paradoxical given the traditional association of women with the private sphere and men in the public. But in an era where Richard Serra's tilted arc becomes symbolized old-fashioned attitudes held by artistic freedom.
attitude that saw artistic freedom as superior to and irreconcilable with the needs of the public, an era when the public's acceptance of the art that invaded its spaces could no longer be taken for granted. The involvement of women artists in a multitude of publicly funded, large-scale, urban projects led in crucial ways to the reshaping of this entire field. Women introduced new attitudes and iconographies to public art projects, in which they sought to express the self not simply as the personal I, but worked instead to blend the personal with the public, pointing the way toward a reconciliation of the traditional concerns of the artist with those of the community.
This has been actually a really influential piece, like especially like this when talking about. It was already kind of interesting to me, like talking about like the 1970s modernism and like the rise of the feminist movement within art and how they kind of separates from other. How it's kind of more of an over-encompassing thing and more of like a distinct like art style, right? It's a movement that can encompass multiple other movements or styles, like environmentalism to the other ones that were mentioned, but in the same sense that like environmentalism art is kind of the same. Maybe not actually. It's probably, I guess there's difference there. I'm just gonna stop what I was gonna say because I thought through and it makes sense. Don't you hate when that happens? Or love when that happens because at least you call yourself? Don't you fucking close.
Artists such as Alice Adams, Alice Aycock, Agnes Deans, Lauren Ewing, Jackie Ferrara, Nancy Holt, Valerie Yaudon, Joyce Kozloff, Mary Miss, Patsy Norvell, Beverly Pepm, Jody Pinto, Alexis Smith, Muriel Eucles, and many, many others turned landfills into public parks, designed and decorated plazas, convention centers, schools, bridges, airports, and railroad stations. Sensitive to the social and cultural history of the sites where they had been invited to intervene, they interacted closely with members of the community, worked in teams with engineers and architects, and negotiated with local governments and art agencies. I have thought a lot about why women have such a powerful voice and presence in this field, Joyce Kozloff has recently written. Partly I believe it is because women are acculturated to the interpersonal, relating skills that public art requires. And partly because the women in the field, most of whom were in their 40s in the 1980s, came to maturity during the social and political movements of the 60s and 70s, and really have a passionate commitment to extending art into the real world. 46. As Kozloff's comment suggests, feminist artists of the 1970s were highly conscious of a common thread of women's sensibility that seemed to run through the great diversity of their art forms. And at its best, feminist art did shape a tentative female universal out of multiple particulars, whose very differences made emergent patterns resonate. However, this high-wire fusion of the private and universalizing agendas backfired when, in the 1980s, critics singled out feminist art's most literalist experiments and proclaimed them to be essentialist-false universals that did not represent all women, something their creators had never claimed in the first place. French feminist critiques of Freud's theories of femininity and his familiar dick. From that biology is destiny, there is no such...
What? You just said? French feminist critique of Freud's theories of femininity and his familiar dick. I'm sorry. Look, it's just... Sorry, dick. Wrong, by the way. It's funny. I guess it'd be more like rump, but... Also, let's see here. I want to become famous by followers and viewers on bigfollows.com. Fuck off. Wait, yeah, can I, like, mute you? Or, like, ban you? No, not from this. Okay.
Thing, wrote Havline Success in 1975, as destiny, nature, or essence, but living structures, 47, were applied to visual representation by British feminist film theorists such as Laura Mulvey, Pam Cook, and Claire Johnston, who saw as anathema to feminism the idea of a historically unchanging feminine essence. 48 By 1980, feminist art criticism had begun to identify feminist art that focused on the female body with a wrong-headed belief in a female essence residing somewhere in the body of woman. 49 But even from the beginning, first-generation feminists had been criticized for what would later be called essentialism. Writing in 1972 in response,
French feminist critique of Freud's theory of femininity and his familiar dicrum that biology is destiny. There is no such thing, wrote, as destiny, nature, essence, but living structures. True. Were applied to visual representation by British feminist film theorists as Laura Mulvey, Pam Cook, Claire Johnson, who saw the anathema of the femina? I don't know. Oh, to feminism, the idea of a historically unchanging feminine essence. Okay, wait, hold up. Freud's theories of femininity and his familiar dicrum of biology is destiny were applied to visual representations by British feminist film theorists such as Laura Mulvey, Pam Cook, who saw the anathema of feminism, the idea of a historical, unchanging feminine essence. By the 1980s, feminist art criticism had begun to identify feminist art that focused on the female body with the wrong-headed belief in female essence residing somewhere within the body of the woman. Yeah, see, that's what I was saying, how it's kind of problematic. But even from the beginning, first-generation feminism had been criticized for what would be later called essentialism.
To an idea that was already in the air at the time, Patricia Maynardi disclaimed the notion of a feminine sensibility in art, resisting the implicit restriction of women's art to the realm of female anatomy, when men had a wider range of expressive possibility, with the Fayidalm to be sensitive and delicate or strong and bold, to make art out of their loves and hates, their politics and religion 50 for women, said Maynardi, the only aesthetic freedom worth fighting for is the freedom to do the same. Without naming names, Maynardi spoke of a right wing of the women artists movement that was codifying a so-called female aesthetic, an implied indictment of Judy Chicago's centralized core imagery, which became explicit in a critique written by Cindy Nemser a year later. Nemser reported that in 1971, Chicago, fresh from her Fresno teaching, was answering the frequently asked question, was there a women's art distinct from men's art, with her theory of cunt art, a case for, in Nemser's description, an intrinsic female imagery created out of round, pulsating, womb-like forms. 5y Nemser denounced this theory.
What? Okay. Maynardi spoke of a right wing of the woman artists movement that was codifying a so-called feminist aesthetic, an implied indictment of Judy Chicago's centralized core imagery, which became explicit in critique written by Cindy Nemser a year later. Nemser reported that in 1971, Chicago, fresh from her Fresno teaching, was answering the frequently asked question, was there women's art distinct from men's art, with her theory of cunt art, a case for, in Nemser's description, an intrinsic female imagery created out of round, pulsating, womb-like forms. Nemser denounced this theory. Okay, I think I see what they're saying. I think they're cunt art, as it's called. It's we're talking academics here, okay? Don't TOS me. But I think this artist Nesmer made a theory called of cunt art, and it was the idea of this art to represent womb-like forms. People were asking her if there was a distinction between men's art and women's art, and she denounced this. Okay, I get now what they're saying. It took me a second.
And in later writings she adduced the diversity and range of contemporary women's art to argue against any too narrowly defined aesthetic for women's art in general. 59 The urtext for the aesthetic credo that had been formulated by Chicago and Scapiro was an article co-authored by the two artists in March 1972, and published in Woman and Space Journal the following year. What does it feel like to be a woman? They asked. To be formed around a central core and have a secret place which can be entered and which is also a passageway from which life emerges? What kind of imagery does this state of feeling engender? The artists went on to point to some of the many women artists who have defined a central orifice whose formal organization is often a metaphor for a woman's body. Georgia O'Keeffe, whose haunting mysterious passage through the black portal of an iris was the first recognized step into the darkness of female identity. Page 26, Lee Bontecu, whose images of vaginal central cavities present female identity as both active and passive. Page 26, Louise Nevelson in her boxes, Deborah Remington's eggs, Scapiro's centralized hollows, and Chicago's central core images. 54 What the critics saw as potentially confining women to their biological identity, Scapiro and Chicago saw as a means of liberating women from negativizing attitudes about female anatomy and their own bodies. They cautioned, in fact, that the visual symbology they described should not be seen simplistically as vaginal or womb art, but rather as the framework for an imagery that would reverse the loathing and devaluation.
Okay.
Introduction. Feminism and Art in the 20th Century. 2y1. Of female anatomy in patriarchal culture. The woman artist could take that very mark of her otherness and by asserting it as the hallmark of her iconography, establish a vehicle by which to state the truth and beauty of her identity. 5y It was in this spirit that they had embraced the derogatory sexual term cunt, traditionally used by men to alienate women from their own sexuality, with the goal of reclaiming a female descriptor and transforming it into a celebratory term. In seeking to reinstate a positive view of femaleness through frank celebration of the female body and its biological powers, Chicago and Shapiro anticipated the approaches of certain feminist writers of the period who also later came to be denounced as essentialist, especially Mary Daly and Adrienne Rich. Daly claimed that female energy is essentially biophilic, while Rich described the female body, its diffuse sensuality, lunar-timed menstruation, its power to give birth as having far more radical implications than we have yet come to appreciate. 56 Rich noted what Chicago and Shapiro had earlier observed: patriarchal thought has limited female biology to its own narrow specifications.
I see, so they're claiming
The feminist vision has recoiled from female biology for these reasons. It will, I believe, come to view our physicality as a resource, rather than a destiny. 57 in part, the emphasis on the biological and...
Especially with the debate today on gender, that's what I was trying to kind of like get to, because they were saying female energy is essentially biophilic, while Rich describes female body's diffuse sensuality, lunar time menstruations, its power to give birth, as having far more radical implications than we have yet to appreciate. Patriarchal thought has limited female biology to its own narrow specifications. The feminist vision has recoiled from female biology for these reasons. It will, I believe, come to feel our physicality as a resource rather than its destiny. I think that again this is at the time I think where like, you know, trans rights obviously and guide, not even just trans rights, but like, you know, I guess if just, well, what's it called for? Because it's feminism, it wouldn't be like transism. That doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound like a term I've heard before, but like I guess kind of like a ideology for like trans people. I don't know what you'd call it, but I'm sure they weren't kind of exactly thinking about that time because it wasn't as like a prevalent of an idea. But I think that even applies more so today than ever, especially with our obviously they were focusing a lot more on the biological aspects, but there's also like one thing that they said, that it's feminist vision had recoiled from female biology for these reasons. I will believe come to view the physicality as a resource rather than its destiny. It was, you know, part of it said they were reclaiming part of like the assumptions on the women biology that have been placed on men, especially in the past, that still permeates our society today. You know, but yeah, obviously there's some more to it. Obviously, I think it's also like a mental aspect as well that we're learning a lot more about and exploring and justifying a lot more today, right? Anyways.
Sexual in early feminist art must be understood against the historical background of the severe repression of women's sexuality in the 1950s and 1960s. Heterosexual women were not encouraged to experience their bodies directly, but only as they were perceived and used by men and children. Young women were taught to value their bodies as a trophy to give or withhold, official, only the latter, in response to male desire, and, after marriage, as the vehicle for wifely duty. Female sexual pleasure was framed and mediated by constructs of good girl versus bad girl, chastity versus shame. Given the centuries of indoctrination of women in the determinism of their biological identity, it is not surprising that in the early 70s feminist artists should have taken their first rebellious step by challenging the most repressive category, the sexual.
Hold up, I want to pause this. What? Heterosexual women were not encouraged to experience their bodies directly, but only were perceived to be used by men and children. Young women were taught to value their bodies, trophies to give or withhold, responses to the male desire, and after marriage as a vehicle for wifely duties. Excuse me. Female sexual pleasure was framed and meditated by constructs of good girl versus bad girl, chastity versus shame, given this, you know, basically like that whole dichotomy of, oh, girl, you can't have sex with too many people, but also I want you to be an experience, yada yada, all that dumb shit. Female sexual pleasure was framed and meditated by constructs of good girl versus bad girl, chastity versus shame, given centuries of indoctrination by women and determinism to their biological identity. It's not surprising that in the early 70s, feminist arts were taken to first ability by challenging the most repressive category, the sexual.
Indeed, they may have reneged the most radical move possible when they asserted the power to define their sexuality in art on their own terms, not MEFs. Thus they openly celebrated the female body from an experiential viewpoint, exploring their and society's attitudes about the body, and proclaiming female organs through cunt imagery as metaphoric emblems of women's independent power and freedom from male dominance.
That makes exactly.
First-generation feminists re-examined what female meant, not in an effort to limit it to a biological essence, but rather, to test the culturally constructed definitions of the feminine that they knew. In Chicago's Cock and Cunt play performed at Woman House in 1979, he and she sport giant cloth penis and vagina appendages, conspicuously attached to their natural bodies as foreign materials. When he tells she that a cunt means you wash the dishes, she looks at her appendage and says, "I doft see where it says that on my cunt." From a position of commonsensical self-knowledge, and with the subversive power of humor, Chicago and her students ridiculed gender roles in human anatomy, thereby challenging the Freudian construct that biology is destiny, and mocked the social definitions of what belongs naturally to the sphere of the female. The CalArts students who created Woman House were guided by the theory and formation of their teachers Chicago and Scapiro, but because as a matter of process, consciousness-raising and self-examination preceded art-making, individual solutions were grounded in experience rather than theory. For this reason, the art produced by the students could not be essentialist because it did not claim that level of generalization. Yet Scapiro and Chicago themselves theorized a central core imagery that did aim to establish a certain universalizing formal iconography for women, and whose potential scope could be demonstrated in the recurrence of centralized forms in Womph's art. When this thesis was taken up for consideration by Lucy Lippard in her introduction to the Women Choose Womph,
the CalArts students who created Woman House were guided by a theory in formation of their teachers Chicago and Shapiro, but because as a matter of process, consciousness raising, self-examination precede art making, individual solutions were grounded in experimental rather than theory. For this reason, the art produced by students could not be essentialist because they did not claim that level of generalization, yet Shapiro and Chicago themselves theorized a central core imagery that did aim to establish certain universalizing formal iconography for women, and whose potential scope could be demonstrated in the recurrence of centralized forms in women's art. The Women's Thesis was taken up consideration by Lucy Lippard in her introduction. Women's Choose Wometh exhibition
of 1973, critical reaction escalated, and charges of what would later be called essentialism began to be heard in every quarter, especially from women artists. 5 In fact, in her very brief remarks, Lippard herself had entertained the thesis of Womph's special predilection for centrally focused images only in a tentative and exploratory way, noting that she had observed in Womph's art made in 1970–71 certain recurrent preoccupations, such as a uniform density, or overall texture, often sensuously tactile and repetitive to the point of obsession, the preponderance of circular forms and central focus, sometimes contradicting the first aspect, a new fondness for the pinks and pastels and the ephemeral cloud colors that used to be taboo unless a woman wanted to be accused of making feminine art. 59. By 1973, however, what Lippard had observed in women's studios, a large sample of which was included in the Women Choose Womph exhibition, could no longer be regarded as a pure product of the female unconscious unmediated by feminist theory. The choice of pinks and pastels, fruit and vaginal imagery, eggs and breasts, on the part of women artists connected to each other through their common awareness of the broader women's movement was a political
made not certain recurrent occupants such as uniform density or overall texture, often sensuously tactile and repetitive to the point of obsession, the preponderance of circular forms and central focus, sometimes contrasting the first aspect, a new fondness for pinks, pastels, and ephemeral cloud colors that used to be taboo unless women want to be accused of making feminine art. There were several women who was large as pure products of female conscious unmediated by feminist theory. The choice of pinks, pastels, fruit, vaginal imagery, eggs, and breasts on the part of women artists connect to each other through the common awareness of broader women's movement. It was a political act. Okay.
Act. a defiance of the conventions that had made it death for earlier women artists to associate themselves with forms and iconography that had been stereotypically and pejoratively deemed feminine. Traditionally feminine iconography was now reclaimed by politicized women artists to serve the cause of feminist art. And thus, paradoxically, while the raging debate within feminism in the period between 1970 to 75 was about whether or not women's art could be defined in absolute terms, emerging feminist consciousness in an ever-broadening spectrum of artists was making it impossible to identify a pure woman artist who could be said to have a female essence untouched by feminist ideas. Increasingly, women's art was distinguished both by the use of female-identified forms in a self-conscious way and by resistance to the idea that women should use such forms. The 1970s debate about women's art was consistently misdirected to the question of whether rather than how women used certain forms. For example, critics of essentialist theory correctly pointed out that both men and women have used biomorphic or centralized imagery Hepworth but also Moore and Arp, O'Keeffe but also Dove and Bachotes, Chicago but also Johns and Noland. Indeed, the centralized core form has assumed an archetypal status in art, Jungian or otherwise. Y1, the power of feminist art. Recurring in Neolithic stone circles, medieval manuscripts, Gothic rose windows, and Renaissance central plan churches, to name but a few. This recurrent archetypal structure, which may or may not be gender-specific, seems to be deeply embedded in the human psyche. However, each age provides a different theoretical justification for its use: theology for Gothic and Renaissance art, in different ways, Tudian psychology for Surrealism, and feminism for Chicago and Scapiro. Similarly, both male and female artists in the 1960s and 70s used central form imagery, yet the question to be posed is not whether the form language is essentially female or male, but, rather, what is signified when that form language is used by women or men. In this case, the categoric female is appropriate. In 1974, Judy Chicago observed, "I'd say the difference between Pasadena L/E Zavers and a Kenneth Noland target is the fact that there is a body identification between me and those forms, and not between Noland and the target. I really think that differentiates women's art from MEF's 60 theorist that she is." Chicago believes that women's art, like her own, proceeds from body identification. That many pre-feminist women artists have used centralized imagery, as Chicago and Scapiro pointed out, does not prove that all women mystically share this viewpoint. But we can say that under the influence of feminist theory in the 1970s, many women were drawn to use centralized imagery with the understanding that it is about the body, a theoretical position not taken by men as a group. It was, in fact, not in males' interest, as the dominant group, to define themselves as a group at all, though it was advantageous for women, like other socially oppressed groups, such as blacks and Chicanos, to identify themselves as a group in order to solidify their opposition to oppression. Today, the founders of feminist art do not renounce or den their characterization as essentialist, and it is perhaps more useful to further articulate the term than to resist it. We would do well to replace the term biological essentialism, which no known feminist has ever championed, with two others: cultured essentialism and political essentialism, which can be historically distinguished. Cultural essentialism, roughly equivalent to what is today called socially constructed femininity, is society's stereotyped conditioning of women's self-lineage and experience. It is very difficult for women to escape this conditioning, even when we want to, for we are all contaminated by past meaning. Moreover, if femininity is a social construction, then we must acknowledge that women have had a role in constructing it, simply by their gradual, self-implicating acceptance and perpetuation of its terms. How can women ever escape from cultural essentialism? The first step, according to Earl, 70s.
This getting some deep stuff. But we can say that under the influence of feminist theory in the 1970s, many women were drawn to centralized. Understanding about the body, a theoretical position that's not taken by men. In fact, it was in fact not in males' interest, dominant group, to define themselves as a group at all, though it was advantageous for women, like other especially oppressed groups, to identify themselves in order to solidify opposition to oppression. Today, founders of feminism do not renounce their characterization of as essentialism, and it's perhaps more useful to further articulate the term than to resist it. We would well do to replace the term biological and steel, I don't know how to say that, which no known feminists ever championed, with two other cultured something with political enthusiasm, I don't know, which can be historically distinguished. Cultural essentialism, roughly equivalent to what today is called societally constructed femininity, society, gender, stereotype, constructed discipline experience. It's very difficult for women to escape this conditioning, even when we want to, for we are all contained by the past meanings. More femininity is a social construct, we must acknowledge that women had a role in constructing it simply by their gradual self-indicating acceptance. I like that. Okay, let's save this real quick. Okay.
Feminists, was to identify its manifestations. When Judy Chicago observed about her menstruation bathroom at Woman House, however we feel about our own menstruation is how we feel about seeing its image in front of us. 61 She introduced the pragmatic view that to deal with the social construction of one and that has been imposed on us we have to begin by acknowledging its effects upon our psyches. And for artists, imaging is a means of discovering how one feels about such things. The young artists at Walnut House began by representing what could be called the icons of their own oppression: lingerie, dollhouses, women's clothing, makeup, since these familiar objects had helped to shape their identities, which were composed of socialized attitudes as well as rebellious ones. Mimicking the societally ordained forms of femininity proved to be the first step of separation, of gaining critical distance from that which is being mimicked. As Luce Irigaray would later observe, when women lack a language of their own outside that of the patriarch, mimicry is the only available form of critiquing its values, of exposing by an effect of playful repetition what should have remained hidden. 62. Although it was not then so named, cultural essentialism was recognized in the early 1970s as the problem to which political essentialism, the deliberate celebration of culturally essentialist forms, offered a solution. The claim of Shapiro and Chicago that WOMF's art might have common and enduring characteristics must be understood as, above all, a deeply political claim. Its purpose was not to establish a Procrustean identity for women's art but, rather, to help balance gender values in society, by asserting the inherent validity of all things in woman's sphere, from vaginas to lipsticks, as fit subject matter for art. Through art made by women, which would necessarily present such things differently from men, those feminist artists believed they could, in Shapiro's words, redress the trivialization of WOMF's experience 6Y as a necessary first stage of value building, comparable to the Black is Beautiful phase of the civil rights movement. It perhaps necessarily left the sorting out of what is biological and what is cultural to a later stage. Equally political in intent but misread as culturally essentialist was the impulse on the part of many early feminist artists to connect with a historical female ancestry: Mary Beth Edelson with the ancient great goddess, Miriam Shapiro with Mary Cassatt and Dido Kahlo, May Stevens with Artemisia Gentileschi, Judy Chicago with all the historical guests at TLZE Dimser Party. When Shapiro led the way in singling out for admiration the anonymous women whose art was needlework last of all, the quilt makers' anti-essentialist critics argued that to glorify the female categories of art production was to ghettoize women's art, by reifying modern woman's association with female stereotyped art forms/Y4. However, Shapiro was not saying that female traditionalist categories should be perpetuated, merely that they have existed historically, and that within severe social constraints, women have made a culture that deserves attention, admiration, and commemoration. From this perspective, to pay homage to women's traditional arts is not to identify with a cultural dead end, it is to honor those whose creativity took particular channels because it was prevented from taking others. And in a different but related instance, when Shapiro and Joyce Kozloff chose to use a variety of non-Western decorative patterns, such as Islamic or Japanese, in their work of the 1970s and 80s, they did so not because women had originally invented or produced those patterns, in fact, they had not, it was not, in other words, an embrace of biological essentialism but a culturally specific challenge to it, for it was their intention to liberate an area of visual expression that had long been gendered as feminine by male Euroculture and hence devalued, policed, and controlled in Western art. Thus to incorporate references to women's traditional arts in Introduction, Feminism and Art in the 20th Century Y5. Georgia O'Keeffe. Goat's Head with Red. 1945. Pastel on paperboard, mounted on paperboard, 27% x 3111/LD. Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C. Gift of Joseph H. Hirshhorn, 1972. Lee Bontecu. Untitled. 1963. Soot and aniline dye on muslin, 39x36. Private collection. Rose window, north transept. 13th century.
For it was intention to liberate an area of visual expression that had long been gendered as feminine by male Euroculture and hence devalued, policed, and controlled by Western art, or controlled in Western art. Thus, incorporated references to women's traditional arts in a biological essentialism book, a culturally specific challenge to it. Thus, to incorporate references of women's traditional arts in
one's own contemporary art was not only to make creative use of devalued but still aesthetically viable forms and ideas, but also to make political use of them in order to engage the dominant male culture dialectically. In reviving the art and rituals of their foremothers, feminists gave those forms new life and status in the cultural order by challenging the value system that had subordinated them. But feminists of the early 1970s were not colonial quilters or Neolithic earth mothers, they were largely urban, educated, middle-class women. Their desire to pay homage to their female forebears was already a historicization of their identification with female tradition, and if they then brought those genres, tastes, and values into high art in modern culture, it was in the spirit of a revival that aided the creation of something distinctly different. As Walter Pater said about classical revivals, we can't be Greeks now 65. The classical analogy is apt on another level, because just as the forms and values of classical antiquity were revived in the Renaissance and again in the 18th century for social and political reasons serving as moral justification for the cultural empowerment of a particular viewpoint 66, so the 1970s feminist articulation of a body-based female aesthetic gained political credibility and power when coupled with a self-conscious definition and revival of a female tradition in art. Thus while the idea of a categoric women's art may be philosophically dubious, it was a valuable creative principle for the historical feminist art movement, which drew in its early stages upon a form of female essentialism, a belief in the unitary reality of the category female as its source of artistic inspiration. The significance of the category female for early feminists was not biological, that was merely its sign, but political, for feminism's power, it was then believed, was the power of women as a group. In this sense, the accuracy of the essentialist belief is beside the point, since right or wrong, it was an enabling myth. Like other empowering essentialist ideas in history, e.g., that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, that there is a great chain of being, that utopian political states will bring peace and justice to earth, or that the human male but not the female may possess artistic genius. It opened the way to political change in society, and a door to creativity and discovery in art. Real world. Postmodernism's anti-essentialist position thus attacks the theoretical foundation of first-generation feminism on seemingly logical grounds, but ignores the diverse artistic superstructure that was built upon it. As many women have complained, this perpetually deconstructive, negative, and hostile stance is an unproductive approach for feminists. Moreover, as a postmodern position,
Postmodern's anti-essentialist position thus... Okay, what is essentialism? That's what I'm trying to figure out right now still. Because I'm sure they went over it, but I think it went over my head. Again, it's a very dense reading. Essential oil sound. Essentialism is the view that objects have a set attribute that are necessary to their identity. Okay, I think I see how that, with everything that they're saying earlier. Because they did say, like, you know, the woman had, was a part of developing femininity, even if it was under, you know, obviously you have to remember that that was under the constraints of a male-dominated society, and, you know, they're dealing with their own, they have to deal with their own perceptions of their society, and how that relates to their identity and stuff, as well as what other people want their identities to be. But yeah, that's what that other thing I was saying earlier, right? In this reading, if I got that right. Moreover, as postmodern position is theoretically, I don't know. Postmodern's anti-essential position thus attack theoretical foundations of first-generation feminism on seemingly logical grounds, but ignores the diverse artistic superstructure that it was built upon. As many women have complained, this perpetuality, deconstructive, negative, and hostile stance is an unproductive approach for a feminist. Yeah, so basically saying, you know, like, being like, oh, these female artists promoted the essentialism and the idea of femininity and that's bad. You know, we gotta ignore that. I think that is kind of unfair because, you know, they're also part of their time, and, you know, the constraints that are put upon them, they're reacting to it. I mean, we're all human, right? We're not fucking God. Though, as much as we like to think we are sometimes.
It is also theoretically inconsistent, for why should essentialist feminism be the only exception to the postmodern tenet that culture produces multiple meanings, all of them equal in value? In a sense, the very figment of an essentialism that never was has served as a creative prod to women artists working in the 80s and 90s, artists such as Janine Antoni, Ida Applebrug, Barbara Krugme, and Lorna Simpson, to demonstrate the many ways that women's art can expand and articulate female identity beyond the given of female anatomy. See Shore and Cottingham chapters. More problematic, however, has been the emergence in the 1980s of a feminist art that revives old masculinist constructs of the female body, theoretically in a critical spirit, though this is not always visually clear, while putting down as naive and reductively biological the far more radical female imagery of the early years. Disturbed and bewildered by the popularity of Cindy Shermaff's work, the critic Jeff Perrone, writing in 1983, cut to the heart of the issue. Sherman poses herself in Playboy-like centerfolds, albeit clothed in little schoolgirl outfits that make her appear both withdrawn and new wave, seductive and scared, a punk virgin waiting to get laid. I think some people wouldn't like it so much because some critics and collectors, men, like a little blonde served up in FLDCY color. That her photographs are ostensibly about female representation in popular culture seems beside the point, not to mention evasive. Her work is, from the consumer's point of view, having your cheesecake and eating it too. Gs. Feminist artists who emerged in the 80s and early 90s have maintained an ambivalent dialogue with 70s feminist art. They developed directly from it, yet are at pains to distance themselves both from it and from the essentialist heresy by which contemporary critical theory has increasingly characterized 70s feminism/Y7 and, indeed, the first generation's approach contrasts strikingly with postmodernist theory's curious insistence that although an essentialist feminine does not exist, femininity, as a social construction, is not a stable reality either. This, of course, has left wide open the ontological question of what is real, while depriving women of their history by dismissing as beneath consideration practically everything that flesh and blood women.
Hold back up. Again, dense reading. Feminist artists who emerged in the 80s and the early 90s have maintained ambivalent dialogues. Feminists, they felt directly from it. Paints distance themselves from both from it and from essentialist heresy, by which contemporary critical theory has increasingly characterized 70s feminism, and indeed, first generation approach contrasts strikingly with postmodernist theory. Curious insistence that although essentialist feminine does not exist, femininity femininity as social construct is neither a stable reality is not. Approach a contract strikingly with postmodernist theory. Curious insistence that although an essentialist feminine does not exist, so an essentialist female person, femininity as a social construct is not stable reality either. It's always something that's changing. I get that.
Have historically accomplished in the, perhaps as a result of postmodernism's denunciation of essentialism, the only acceptable way remaining for post-70s women to represent themselves appears to be in slightly ironized versions of the old familiar images of femininity i.e., as sex objects and victims that have traditionally been devised by and for men. Such images can be read as a critique of the social construction of femininity and of the power and complicity of representation in creating the illusion of fixed identity, but, as Perron pointed out, they don't have to be. And the question remains open whether the male viewer, whose voyeuristic position is still privileged by such images, is being made by the artist to feel comfortable, or uncomfortable, with that position. The answer to that question constitutes a major difference between Sherman's postmodern images, see page 257, and the staged costume images produced in the early 1970s by students in the feminist art program. Dori Atlantis's 1970 photograph of Cheryl Zuriljan as Cupid doll, for example, Wilding, page 37, breaks through the confinement of that stereotype to become an act of defiance and self-empowerment by virtue of a parody so relentless and so clearly exaggerated that this image can no longer function in the normal way to gratify. 28. The power of feminist art. And empower a male spectator while disempowering and defining the female objects of his gaze, but rather, it unequivocally ridicules and exposes that mechanism. The very ambiguity of Sherman's brand of feminist art, on the other hand, may have unintentionally opened the door to some of the 1990s most blatant reassertions of the social manipulation of female identity, such as the living doll fashion.
The very ambiguity of Sherman's brand of feminist art, on the other hand, may have unintentionally opened the doors to some of the 1990s most blatant reassertions of social manipulation of female identity.
Photographs recently featured by the New York Times Magazine in the hope of inducing women past the age of puberty, as the caption put it, to want to dress up like little girls. S9. Distressingly close in appearance to the self-affirming feminist statements of the early 70s, these photographs, which advocate acquiescence to oppression all over again in the name of fashion, are in reality total inversions of those early images and are anything but feminist. The dialectical relationship between them is in all likelihood not the result of influence, but of the re-emergence of an atavistic instinct and an all too familiar strategy to repress women by infantilizing them and hoping that they will go along with it. But by now, thanks in part to the power of feminist art, we know the difference. Certainly the best evidence that within women lies something other than determinist social constructions is the fact that feminists could rebel against and question patriarchy at all. In feminism's rebellious challenge to masculinist art, the mind and body worked together to produce a coherent female self and, as well, a blanket denial of the passive feminine being that had been the patriarchy's creation. So coherent a self is both terrifying to our culture and a terrifying responsibility to live up to. It is no wonder that today, as in earlier feminist movements, men, and often women have worked to submerge, deny, or distort women's effort to do so. And yet, the case can be made that feminism, in its very recurrences, has demonstrated an enduring power to survive its challengers. In the 1970s, feminism's exploration of who we are was powered by a complex dynamic interchange between the political goal of fulfilling a shared agenda for all women and the necessary path to that goal through the diversity of individual experience. Feminist art kept those potentially contradictory goals in a state of tension, holding in balance a pull in opposite directions by public political and private aesthetic values. Of course, it had been the goal of feminism to dissolve what it saw as the artificial boundary between those categories, to insist that on every level, the personal is the political. In the 1970s, this phrase was understood to imply that the reality of women's lives was larger than their traditional circumscription in the realm of the private and the personal, and that, indeed, the very categories of private and public were in themselves political fictions. In the 1990s, the phrase could be understood in almost an opposite sense, to describe the rather cynical contemporary doctrine that there is no self outside socially inscribed roles and meanings, the personal is only the political. But for feminists of the 1970s, the slogan contained in its implicit rejection of the traditional doctrine of separate spheres an empowering idea: the personal was liberated to become the political, which it had never before been for women. And thus a path was opened to creative action upon and within society. Lealton Licent Tiakl, GGL Alkli /IYKLL in the 20th century 29. Notes.
We got it. We did it. We did it. Oh my god, we did it. It's 8:55. We got it done. Okay. Okay. Well, shit. Probably gonna end the stream here for today. I was trying to think if I found this reading to be very interesting because it kind of gives you like a bit of a history of like feminism too and some of the ideas that were going on. Well, also I think this is a really good reading if you're kind of like struggling with art to kind of get an idea of where like some of the like art world has gone. And this is something it's a problem for me. I feel like sometimes, you know, I get like, oh, I'm really proud of what I made, and then like I get criticized to all high hell. I'm like, okay, I just say all the high hell, but like, you know, I get it. Academically, like, you know, I get professors get academically critical of like art stuff, and now you're saying like, oh, you're actually doing something derogatory. It's not anything like that. It's just more like, yeah, but how does this excite me? You know, like for example, there was the thing about like the egotistical like purpose of art to me, instead of being like a representation of one's own one's own like experience and depicting it, instead being something that the society itself can also try to connect with. I thought that was really good, not to hear just even from like, oh, it's cool that feminist art did that, right? Promoted that kind of thing, but even more so that that's something that should be considered art in general. You know, that's something that's in general I think that's been happening more. I've been kind of actually like reading that, and then like what I've been kind of experiencing over like the last few months, and kind of like learning about art history some more. I've been trying to get a little bit more in depth with it. It's kind of made me realize like the kinds of movements and how the art world has changed. Right, there's like certain expectations because of the offense in these movements, right? That challenge ideas and stuff. That is why maybe some people might be excited about some stuff over other things. Let's look at this. Looks kind of smooth, like it's more smoothed out. That looks good. Or at least it looks like more like a gradient kind of coming up from up here instead of being like a flat wall. Okay. Well, anyways, thanks for watching and listening to some feminist art history theory with me. If you like what you saw, comment, like, subscribe, share, follow. I got a rate response, and I'm not gonna do that here because I gotta use my blackboard. Yeah, I don't think they're